Intelligence Trap: Why Smart People Do Stupid Things and How to Make Wiser Decisions. The Termites' Ascension and Fall. What intelligence is and isn't. The children in Lewis Terman's study couldn't have known that the results of their tests would forever affect their lives or world history when they nervously sat down for their exams. Nonetheless, each would come to be identified by their replies in their own manner, for better or worse, and their individual trajectories would forever alter our understanding of the human mind. Shirkin, J. 1992, Terman's Kids. The groundbreaking study of how the gifted grow up. Boston, Ma. Little, Brown, tells the story of the following 4 children in considerably greater depth, along with the lives of the other termites. Sarah Ann, a 6-year-old with thick spectacles and a gap between her front teeth, was one of the brightest. She casually slipped a gumdrop in between her papers after she finished scrawling her answers, perhaps as a modest bribe for the examiner. When the scientist inquired if it had been dropped there by the fairies, she guffawed. She stated kindly, "A small girl gave me 2. However, because I am recovering from the virus, I believe 2 would be detrimental to my digestion." Her IQ was 192, which was on the very high end of the range. Beatrice, a brilliant baby who began walking and talking at the age of 7 months, joined her in the intellectual stratosphere. At the age of 10, she had read 1,400 volumes, and her poetry were reportedly so sophisticated that they totally tricked an English class at Stanford, who mistook them for Tennyson's works, according to a local San Francisco newspaper. Her IQ was 192, like Sarah Ann's. Shelley Smith, 8 years old, was described as a charming youngster, liked by many, with a suppressed gleam in her face. And there was Jess Oppenheimer, who was described as an arrogant, narcissistic boy who had trouble communicating with people and lacked a sense of humor. Their IQs are extremely high. They were hovering at 140, just enough to make Terman's set, but still well above average, and they were clearly on their way to greatness. The IQ test, which was still a relatively new development at the time, had mostly been used to identify persons with learning disabilities up until that point. Terman, on the other hand, was convinced that a few abstract and academic characteristics, such as fact memory, vocabulary, and spatial reasoning, represent an intrinsic general intelligence that underpins all of your cognitive abilities. This primarily intrinsic quality reflected raw brain power that would determine how readily you learned, understood complex concepts, and solved issues regardless of your history or schooling. At the time, he remarked, "There is nothing about an individual as vital as his IQ. We must search for leaders who will develop science, art, governance, education, and social welfare in general among the top 25% of our people, and especially among the top 5% of our population." Sarah Ann, Beatrice, Jess, and Shelley, and the other termites, he hoped would prove his point by predicting their success at school and university, careers and income, health and well-being. He even believed that IQ would predict their moral character by tracking the course of their lives over the subsequent decades. Terman's research would cement the usage of standardized testing around the world, despite the fact that many schools no longer use Terman's exam to screen students. Most of our education still revolves around the development of the limited set of skills reflected in his original test. We must first understand how we came to define intelligence in this way, the abilities this definition captures, and some crucial aspects of thinking that it misses, skills that are equally important for creativity and pragmatic problem solving, but have been completely neglected in our educational system. Only then can we consider the roots of the intelligence trap and its solutions. Many of these blind spots were visible to contemporary researchers as Terman conducted his experiments, and they would become even more apparent in the triumphs and failures of Beatrice, Shelley, Jess, Sarah Ann, and the many other termites as their lives unfolded in sometimes dramatic and unexpected ways. However, because of the fortitude of we're only now beginning to understand what IQ implies and how it affects our decision-making. Indeed, Terman's life story demonstrates how hubris, bigotry, and love may all conspire to make a brilliant brain boomerang disastrously. The seeds of this view of intelligence arose in the scientist's upbringing, as they do with many excellent, though erroneous ideas. In the early 1880s, Terman grew up in rural Indiana. The peaceful, red-headed child would sit and quietly observe his fellow pupils while attending a little red schoolhouse. A single room with no books, a backward albino boy who would only play with his sister, and a feeble-minded 18-year-old who was still struggling to learn the alphabet were among those who drew his derision. Terman later claimed that another playmate, who he described as an imaginative liar, would go on to become a well-known serial killer, though he never revealed which one. Terman, on the other hand, recognized that he was not like the other inquisitive kids. He could read before entering that bookless classroom, and the teacher had permitted him to go ahead and study third-grade topics during the first term. Only until a traveling salesman came to the family farm did he establish his academic supremacy. He chose to pitch a phrenology book after finding a relatively bookish household. He sat with the Terman kids around the fireplace, studying their scalps to show the notions it contained. He stated that the shape of the bone beneath them may disclose their strengths and weaknesses. Something about the lumps and bumps beneath young Lewis' thick ginger tresses seems to have piqued his interest. He prophesied that this young man will go on to accomplish great things. Terman later stated, "I believe the forecast undoubtedly increased my self-confidence a little and caused me to strive for a more ambitious objective than I may otherwise have set." Terman would have realized that phrenology was a hoax by the time he was accepted for a distinguished position at Stanford University in 1910. Nothing in the lumps of his skull could reflect his ability, and he's still convinced that intelligence was an innate trait that would determine one's life path. And he had now discovered a new yardstick by which to compare the weak-minded and the gifted. Terman was enthralled by a test created by Alfred Binet, a famous psychologist in late 19th century Paris. The government recently imposed compulsory education for all children between the ages of 6 and 13, in accordance with the French Republic's concept of equality among all people. However, other students simply did not take advantage of the chance, posing a problem for the Ministry of Public Instruction. Should these idiots be taught in a separate classroom? Should they be sent to a mental institution? Binet co-invented a test with Theodore Simon to aid teachers in assessing a child's growth and making appropriate educational adjustments. Some of the questions could appear ridiculous to a modern reader. Binet had youngsters assess which drawing of a woman's face was prettier as part of a vocabulary exercise. However, many of the challenges reflected critical talents that they will need in the future. To test the child's short-term memory, Binet would repeat a string of numbers or words, for example, and the child would have to recollect them in the correct order. Another question would require them to construct a statement using 3 supplied words, which would be a test of their verbal abilities. Binet himself had no illusions that his test captured the full range of intelligence. He believed that our mental worth was simply too amorphous to be measured on a single scale, and he despised the idea that a low score should come to define a child's future opportunities, believing that it could be malleable over a lifetime. He added, "We must resist and react against this terrible pessimism. We must try to explain that it is grounded on nothing." However, some psychologists, notably Terman, were already embracing the concept of general intelligence, which proposes that the brain is served by some kind of mental energy, which can explain your success in a variety of problem-solving and academic learning situations. You're more likely to be able to read well and recall things if you're faster at mental arithmetic. For example, Terman felt that an IQ test might capture our basic brain power, which is predetermined by our genes, and then predict our total success in a variety of tasks throughout our lives. As a result, he began reworking an English language version of Binet's test, adding questions and broadening the exam for older children and adults, with questions like, how many pencils can you buy for 50 cents if 2 pencils cost 5 cents? Also, what's the difference between being lazy and being idle? Terman revised the way the results were expressed, employing a simple formula that is still in use today. In addition to updating the questions, Terman initially found the average score for each age group, assuming that older children would do better than younger ones. You may calculate a child's mental age by dividing their real age by 100 and multiplying the result. A 10-year-old with an IQ of 150 would think like a 15-year-old. A 10-year-old with an IQ of 90 would think like a 9-year-old. The average would be 100 people of all ages. SIQ is calculated slightly differently for adults who have ceased progressing cognitively, at least according to the notion of general intelligence. Your score is based on where you fall on the renowned bell curve, not on your mental age. For example, an IQ of 145 indicates that you are among the top 2% of the population. Many of Terman's objectives were noble. He sought to provide the educational system an empirical base so that teaching could be suited to a child's abilities. Terman's reasoning was tainted from the start, as he envisioned a form of social engineering based on the test's results. He thought the IQ test could be used to isolate delinquents from society before they committed a crime after profiling a small group of hobos. Morality can't blossom and bear fruit if intelligence is immature, he wrote. Terman's research gained the attention of the U.S. Army during World War I, and his exams were used to analyze 1.75 million men. The smartest were assigned to officer training immediately away, while the weakest were discharged from the Army or assigned to a labor brigade. The method, according to many observers, significantly enhanced the recruitment process. Terman began the project that would consume the rest of his life, a massive study of California's most gifted students, carried along by the wind of achievement. His crew began identifying the best of California's major cities in 1920. Teachers were urged to nominate their finest students, and Terman's aides would test their IQs, choosing only those who scored higher than 140, though the criterion was later dropped to 135, assuming that intelligence was hereditary. His team also evaluated the siblings of these children, allowing them to swiftly form a huge cohort of over 1,000 gifted children, including Jess, Shelley, Beatrice, and Sarah Ann. Terman's team followed the evolution of these children, fondly known as the termites, over the next few decades, and their stories would come to define how we measure genius for nearly a century. Nuclear researcher Norris Bradbury, jail psychiatrist Douglas McGlashan Kelly during the Nuremberg trials, and playwright Lilith James are among the termites who stood out. More than 30 of them were recognized in Who's Who in America by 1959, and almost 80 in American Men of Science. Even while not all of the termites excelled academically, many of them shone in their chosen fields. Consider Shelley Smith, who has been described as the charming youngster who is adored by all. She dropped out of Stanford University and went on to pursue a career in the entertainment industry. She began her work at Life magazine as a researcher and reporter, where she met and married photographer Carl Meidens. She would later describe days spent sprinting through foreign streets in a kind of trance at the sights and sounds she was able to record as they toured around Europe and Asia, reporting on political tensions in the run-up to WWII. Meanwhile, Jess Oppenheimer, the conceited, narcissistic child with no sense of humor, went on to write for Fred Astaire's radio show. When he revealed his own income, he couldn't help but laugh. His fortunes improved further when he met comic Lucille Ball, with whom he co-created the famous television show I Love Lucy. He experimented with filmmaking technology in between script writing, filing a patent for the teleprompter, which is still used by news anchors today. Terman's exams may have simply looked at academic talents, but they did seem to represent a kind of raw underlying brain power that allowed these kids learn new things, solve problems, and think creatively, allowing them to have full and successful lives regardless of the path they chose. Terman's research quickly persuaded other educators. He predicted that mental testing will mature to a lusty maturity during the next half-century, and that within a few score years, pupils from kindergarten to university will be subjected to several times as many hours of testing as would currently be considered fair. He was correct, and in the decades that followed, numerous additional variants of his test would emerge. The latter tests contained more sophisticated nonverbal conundrums, such as the quadrant on the following page, in addition to vocabulary and numerical thinking. The solution requires you to be able to think abstractly and recognize the common rule that governs the progression of shapes, which indicates sophisticated processing skills. Again, according to the concept of universal intelligence, these abstract reasoning skills are believed to represent a kind of raw brain power that underpins all of our thinking, regardless of your specific education. Our education may provide us with specialized knowledge in a variety of fields, but each subject ultimately relies on those more fundamental abstract thinking skills. What pattern brings this quadrant to a close? Most students in the United States and the United Kingdom were sorted according to IQ at the height of its popularity. Although the test is no longer used to screen young pupils, its influence can still be felt across education and the workplace. The Scholastic Aptitude Test, SAT, which is used for college admissions in the United States, was directly influenced by Terman's work in the 1920s. Although the form of inquiry has changed, such tests nevertheless capture the same fundamental abilities to recall knowledge, follow abstract rules, create a wide vocabulary, and notice patterns, prompting some psychologists to refer to them as IQ tests by proxy. Any school and university entrance exams, as well as employee recruiting tests, such as the Graduate Record Examinations, GREs, and the Wunderlich Personnel Test used in the workplace, are similar. Even quarterbacks in the National Football League in the United States take the Wunderlich test during recruitment, based on the assumption that higher intellect can increase players' strategic abilities on the field. This isn't simply a problem in the West. Standardized tests based on IQ can be found all over the world, and in some countries, most notably India, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. An entire industry of cram schools has sprung up to prepare students for exams such as the GRE, which are required for admission to the world's most prestigious universities. To give you a sense of their value, cram schools in India alone are worth $6.4 billion each year. The long-term impact of these theories on our attitudes is just as essential as the tests themselves. Even if you don't believe in IQ tests, many people believe that those abstract reasoning skills, which are so important for academic success, represent an underlying intelligence that automatically translates to better judgment and decision-making in all aspects of life, at work, at home, in finance, and in politics. We assume that having more intellect inevitably entails being better qualified to examine factual facts before reaching a decision. This is why we find odd conspiracy theories like those of Kary Mullis worthy of discussion. We tend to employ nebulous words like life skills, which are impossible to measure properly, and we think that they primarily come to us through osmosis, without conscious training. When we do give lip service to other sorts of decision-making that are not assessed in IQ tests, most of us haven't invested the same amount of time and effort in developing them as we did in developing abstract thinking and reasoning in school. We've been taught that the speed with which we reason determines the quality of our minds. Hesitation and indecision are bad, and any cognitive problem is an indication of our own failures. because most academic assessments are timed and need quick thinking. We admire people who think and act swiftly in general. And slow is simply a term for stupidity. These are all misconceptions, as we will discover in the next chapters, and rectifying them will be critical if we are to escape the intelligence trap. Let's be clear, most psychologists agree that these measures, be they IQ, SATs, GREs, or Wonderlic scores, do reflect something very important about the mind's ability to learn and process complex information. Before we look at the limitations of the theory of general intelligence and the thinking styles and abilities that it fails to capture, let's be clear, most psychologists agree that these measures, be they IQ, SATs, GREs, or Wonderlic scores, do reflect. These ratings are greatest at predicting how well you do in school and university, which is unsurprising considering that they were created specifically for this purpose. But they are also moderately successful at predicting your job path following college. Complex mathematical or scientific topics will be easier to learn and remember if you have the ability to juggle complex information. This ability to understand and recall tough concepts may also help you develop a stronger argument in a history essay. Greater general intelligence is unquestionably advantageous, especially if you wish to pursue disciplines such as law, medicine, or computer programming, which need advanced learning and abstract reasoning. People who score higher on intelligence tests tend to have better health and live longer as a result of the socioeconomic prosperity that comes with a white-collar employment. Neuroscientists have also discovered certain structural abnormalities that could explain why some people have higher overall intelligence than others. For example, in more educated people, the bark-like cerebral cortex is thicker and wrinkled, and they also have larger brains overall. Long-distance neuronal connections between brain regions, dubbed white matter because they are covered in a fatty sheath, appear to be wired differently as well, resulting in more effective signal transmission networks. These differences may combine to result in speedier processing and more short and long-term memory capacity, making it easier to spot patterns and process complex data. It would be stupid to dismiss the significance of these findings and the crucial role that intelligence plays in our lives. The issues arise when we put too much reliance in those measurements' ability to represent a person's complete intellectual potential without taking into consideration the variety in behavior and performance that these scores cannot account for. If you look at polls of lawyers, accountants, and engineers, for example, the average IQ is around 125. Indicating that intellect does matter. However, the scores range from roughly 95, below average, to 157, above average, termite territory. When comparing the success of the individuals in those professions, those varied scores can only account for about 29% of the range in performance as evaluated by managers' ratings. That is undoubtedly a sizable portion. But even when motivation is taken into consideration, there is still a wide range of performance that cannot be explained by their IQ. There are plenty of people with lower IQs who outperform those with much higher scores in any career. And there are plenty of people with higher IQs who don't make the most of their brain power, proving that qualities like creativity or sound professional judgment can't be explained solely by a single number. It's like being tall and playing basketball. Harvard Graduate School of Education's David Perkins told me, "You won't get very far if you don't meet a very fundamental criterion. But if you do, other elements take over." He says, Bennett had warned us about this, and it was evident in the termites' life if you looked closely at the data. They were more successful as a group than the typical American, but a large proportion of them did not achieve their goals. The careers of the 26 brightest termites, each of them had a stratospheric IQ score of more than 180, were studied by psychologist David Henry Feldman. Feldman expected to find that each of these geniuses had outperformed their contemporaries, but just 4 had achieved great professional distinction, becoming, for example, a judge or a highly honored architect. As a group, they were only marginally more successful than those who scored 40 points lower. Consider Beatrice and Sarah Ann, the 2 bright young ladies with IQs of 192 who we met at the beginning of this chapter. Beatrice aspired to be a sculptor and writer, but instead ended up investing in real estate with her husband's money, in stark contrast to Oppenheimer's career, which was at the bottom of the group. Sarah Ann, meantime, received a PhD, but struggled to focus on her work. By her 40s, she was living a semi-nomadic existence, traveling from friend to friend and briefly living in a commune. She later stated, "I think I was taught to be way too self-conscious of my status as a termite, as a child, and given far too little to actually accomplish with this cerebral capacity." We can't rule out the idea that some of the termites deliberately chose not to pursue a high-flying and perhaps stressful job. But if general intelligence was as crucial as Terman claimed, you'd expect more of them to have achieved significant scientific, artistic, or political achievement. There is the frustrating sensation that they could have done more with their lives when we recollect Terman's early optimism about his patient's potential. Says the author, Feldman came to a conclusion. The Flynn effect, a surprising growth in IQ over the last few decades, complicates the perception of general intelligence as an all-powerful problem-solving and learning ability. During a flying visit from New Zealand, I met Flynn at his son's house in Oxford to learn more, and a moral philosopher who dabbles with psychology, says Flynn, who is now a towering figure in intelligence study. It was just meant to be a short distraction, he says, and by dabbling, I mean that it has consumed more than half of my time for the previous 30 years. When Flynn came across disturbing suggestions that certain racial groupings are intrinsically less brilliant, he became interested in IQ. He assumed that disparities in IQ scores were due to environmental factors. For example, richer and more educated households will have a larger vocabulary, implying that their children will perform better in the verbal sections of the test. However, as he examined the numerous studies, he discovered something even more perplexing. Intellect appeared to be increasing with time for all races. Psychologists gradually accounted for this by raising the exam's threshold. To get the same IQ score, you had to answer more questions correctly. However, when comparing raw data, the jump is significant, equating to about 30 points over the last 80 years. Why aren't psychiatrists dancing in the streets about this? I wondered, what in the world is going on? He exclaimed. Psychologists who thought intellect was mostly inherited were taken aback. They calculated that genetics might explain roughly 70% of the difference between persons by comparing the IQ scores of siblings and strangers. However, because genetic evolution is slow, our genes could not have altered quickly enough to create the large increases in IQ that Flynn saw. Instead, Flynn contends that we must address large-scale societal changes. We have been educated to notice patterns and think in symbols and categories from an early age, even if we are not expressly encouraged to take IQ tests. Consider the elementary school classes that taught us about the various branches of the tree of life, as well as the various components and natural forces. According to Flynn, the more children are exposed to these scientific spectacles, the easier it becomes for them to think in abstract terms more broadly, resulting in a continuous gain in IQ over time. Terman's image has been imprinted on our thoughts. Other psychologists were first skeptical. The Flynn effect, on the other hand, has been documented across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and South America, anywhere where industrialization and Western-style educational reforms are taking place. The findings show that general intelligence is influenced by how our genes interact with the culture in which we live. Importantly, and in line with Flynn's notion of scientific glasses. The scores on the various strands of the IQ test had not all grown in the same way. Nonverbal reasoning has improved far more than vocabulary or numerical reasoning. For example, while other talents not assessed by IQ, such as navigation, have declined, we've merely honed a few specialized talents that enable us to think in a more abstract manner. Over time, society places a variety of demands on us, and people must respond. In this way, the Flynn effect demonstrates that we can't simply train one sort of reasoning and expect all of the beneficial problem-solving talents we've come to identify with higher intelligence to follow suit, as some theories would predict. This should be self-evident in everyday life. Even the sharpest 80-year-old, such as Flynn, would appear to be a dunce in comparison to the ordinary millennial if the growth in IQ truly reflected a dramatic improvement in overall thinking. We also don't see an increase in patents, as one might expect if the skills measured by general intelligence tests were critical for the type of technological innovation that Jess Oppenheimer specialized in. Nor do we see a preponderance of wise and rational political leaders, as one might expect if general intelligence alone was required for truly insightful decision-making. We no longer live in the idyllic future that Terman might have anticipated if he had lived long enough to witness the Flynn effect. Clearly, the abilities measured by IQ tests are a significant part of our mental machinery, as they determine how rapidly we acquire and learn complicated abstract knowledge. However, if we are to comprehend the full range of human decision-making and problem-solving abilities, we must broaden our perspective to incorporate many other factors, such as skills and thinking styles that are not always correlated with IQ. Attempts to define alternate forms of intelligence, on the other hand, have frequently failed. For example, emotional intelligence has become a trendy buzzword, although critics have suggested that several popular EQ tests are faulty and fail to predict success better than IQ or measures of normal personality qualities such as conscientiousness. It is undeniable that social skills influence many of our life outcomes. Despite these objections, as we will see in chapters 5 and 9, revised conceptions of emotional intelligence are crucial for our understanding of intuitive reasoning and collective intelligence. Meanwhile, in the 1980s, psychologist Howard Gardner proposed an 8-trait theory of multiple intelligences, which included interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence, bodily kinesthetic intelligence, which makes you good at sports, and even naturalistic intelligence, which refers to your ability to distinguish between different plants in the garden, or even the brand of car you drive based on the sound of its engine. Many experts, however, believe Gardner's hypothesis is overly broad, lacking exact definitions and tests, as well as any valid evidence to back up his claims, beyond the common sense assumption that some people are more drawn to certain abilities than others. After all, we've long known that some people excel at sports while others excel at music. But does this mean they have different intelligences? Why not discuss stuffing beans up your nose intellect as well? Flynn remarked, with his triarchic theory of successful intelligence. Cornell University's Robert Sternberg examines 3 distinct types of intelligence: practical, analytical, and creative, that may all impact decision-making in a variety of cultures and contexts. He apologized for the sound of his small children playing in the yard outside when I contacted him one day, but he quickly forgot about the din as he expressed his dissatisfaction with today's schooling and the antiquated instruments we use to determine mental worth. He compares the lack of advancement in IQ testing to the great breakthroughs made in other sectors, such as medicine. It's like if doctors are still treating life-threatening disease with outdated 19th century treatments. We've gotten to the point where we're using mercury to cure syphilis. He said, the SAT determines who goes into a good institution and then who gets a good career. but all you get are good technicians with no common sense, says the author. Sternberg's fascination, like Terman's before him, began as a child. Sternberg's intelligence is undeniable today. The American Psychological Association named him the 61st most prominent psychologist of the 20th century, 12 places above Terman. His thoughts froze as a second grader before his first IQ test. When the results came in, it was evident to everyone, his teachers, his parents, and even Sternberg, that he was a complete moron. That bad grade quickly became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and Sternberg believes he would have gone along this path if it hadn't been for his 4th grade teacher. She believed a child was more than an IQ score. He said, "Just because she believed in me, my academic achievements skyrocketed." His little mind began to expand and blossom only because of her support. Slippery notions that had before eluded him began to stick, and he eventually advanced to first-class status. He decided to take an introductory psychology class as a freshman at Yale in order to understand why he had been labeled dumb as a child. His interest in developmental psychology led him to pursue postgraduate research at Stanford University. He asked how he could better evaluate the qualities that help people succeed if IQ testing were so uninformative. As fate would have it, observations of his own students began to supply him with the motivation he required. He recalls one particular female, Alice, who had come to work in his laboratory. Her test results were excellent, and she was a perfect student. But when she first came in, she had no creative ideas, he explained. Barbara, another student whose grades were good but not spectacular, but who was bubbling with ideas to test in his lab, was the polar opposite of her. Celia, for example, didn't have Alice's stellar grades or Barbara's creative ideas, but she was tremendously pragmatic. She devised innovative ways to design and execute experiments, organize a productive team, and get her papers published. Sternberg began to create a theory of human intelligence, which he characterized as the ability to attain success in life according to one's personal standards, within one's sociocultural context. After being inspired by Alice, Barbara, and Celia, he confined his idea to just 3 abilities: analytical, creative, and practical, and studied how they can be defined, assessed, and cultivated, avoiding the possibly excessively wide definitions of Gardner's many intelligences. Analytical intelligence is the type of thinking Terman was researching, and it contains the skills that allowed Alice to excel on her SATs. In contrast, creative intelligence studies our ability to create, conceive, and suppose, as Sternberg puts it. While creative writing classes at schools and universities already foster this type of thinking, Sternberg points out that disciplines like history, science, and foreign languages can also include tasks that quantify and train creativity. Would the First World War have occurred if Franz Ferdinand had never been shot? Or what would the world look like now if Germany had won the Second World War? Can be questions posed to a student studying European history. Imagine a scenario through the eyes of a bee in a science lesson about animal vision. Explain what a bee sees that you don't. Students would still be able to demonstrate their factual knowledge by responding to these questions, but they would also be required to engage in counterfactual thinking, imagining scenarios that have never occurred, skills that are plainly helpful in many creative vocations. Jess Oppenheimer used this approach in both his scriptwriting and his technical direction. Meanwhile, practical intelligence is concerned with a different type of innovation, the ability to organize and execute an idea, as well as the ability to solve life's complex, ill-defined challenges in the most pragmatic way possible. It includes characteristics such as metacognition, which refers to your ability to assess your strengths and limitations and figure out the best methods to overcome them, as well as unspoken, tacit knowledge gained from experience that allows you to solve problems on the fly. It also includes those abilities referred to as emotional or social intelligence, such as the ability to discern people's motivations and persuade them to do what you want. Shelley Smith-Myden's rapid thinking as a war reporter, as well as her ability to navigate her way out of a Japanese prison camp, may best exemplify this type of intellect among the termites. Practical intelligence is the most difficult to evaluate or teach directly of the three types of thinking, but Sternberg believes there are ways to foster it in school and university. In a business studies class, this might entail rating several options for dealing with a personnel shortage. In a slavery history class, it might entail asking a student to evaluate the difficulties of implementing the Underground Railroad for escaped slaves. Whatever the subject, the goal is for students to come up with practical answers to a problem they haven't experienced before. Sternberg has also been able to put his theories to the test in a variety of scenarios. He helped establish a psychological summer program for gifted high school students at Yale University. For example, the youngsters were assessed using his many intelligence measures, then separated into groups at random and taught using the principles of a specific type of intelligence. Some were asked to formulate their own theories based on what they had learned after spending a morning studying the psychology of depression. For example, a task to train creative intelligence. Others were asked how they might apply that knowledge to help a friend who was suffering from mental illness. A task to encourage practical thinking. The idea was that some youngsters would play to their strengths while others would work on their inadequacies. Sternberg explained, the outcomes were positive. They discovered that training children according to their specific type of intelligence boosted their overall grades on a final exam, implying that education in general should aid people who think in a more creative or practical way. Furthermore, Sternberg discovered that the practical and creative intelligence tests were able to identify a much wider range of students from various racial and economic backgrounds, a delightful diversity that was evident as soon as they arrived for the course. Sternberg went on to recruit 110 schools, with a total of more than 7,700 students to apply the same ideas to the teaching of mathematics, science, and English language in a later study. The results were unequivocal once again. Children who were taught to develop their practical and creative intelligence made greater gains overall, and even performed better on analytical, memory-based questions, implying that the more balanced approach had helped them absorb and engage with the material. Sternberg's Rainbow Project, for example, worked with admissions departments at a number of universities, including Yale, Brigham Young, and the University of California, Irvine, to develop an alternative entrance exam that combines traditional SAT scores with measures of practical and creative intelligence. He discovered that the new exam was almost twice as accurate as the SAT in predicting students' GPA, grade point average scores in their first year of university, implying that it does indeed capture alternative methods of thinking and reasoning that are important for success in further education. Away from academia, Sternberg has devised and tested practical intelligence tests for corporate leaders and salespeople in a variety of industries, ranging from local real estate agents to Fortune 500 organizations. In one topic, participants were asked to rank potential ways to various scenarios, such as how to deal with a perfectionist colleague whose delayed progress may prevent your group from attaining its goal, using various nudge techniques. In another example, they were asked to explain how they would alter their sales strategy if their inventory was running low. The questions in each case assess people's ability to prioritize tasks and weigh the pros and cons of various options, to recognize the consequences of their actions and anticipate potential problems, and to persuade colleagues of pragmatic compromises that are required to keep a project moving forward without a stalemate. Sternberg discovered that these exams accurately predicted success indicators such as annual revenues, the likelihood of winning a professional award, and overall job satisfaction. Sternberg looked into numerous metrics of leadership performance among platoon commanders, company commanders, and battalion commanders in the military. They were questioned on how to deal with army insubordination, for example, or the best way to communicate a mission's objectives. Again, practical intelligence, specifically tacit knowledge, predicted their leadership abilities better than traditional intelligence measures. Sternberg's metrics may not be as elegant as a one-size-fits-all IQ score, but they are a step closer to determining the type of thinking that allowed Jess Oppenheimer and Shelley Smith-Midens to flourish when other termites failed. Flynn assured me Sternberg is on the right track. He did a good job of demonstrating that more than analytic talents could be measured. Acceptance has been sluggish, which is disappointing. Despite the fact that his policies have been adopted at Tufts University and Oklahoma State University, they are not widely used. People may say things will change, but then things revert to their previous state. Sternberg remarked, "Teachers are still too eager to appraise a child's potential based on narrow, abstract examinations, just as they were when he was a kid, a fact he has witnessed in the schooling of his own children, one of whom is now a successful Silicon Valley entrepreneur. I have 5 kids, and they've all been labeled as potential losers at one point or another," he continued, "and they've all done okay." While Sternberg's research may not have revolutionized education in the way he envisioned, it has inspired other academics to expand on his concept of tacit knowledge, including some fascinating new research on the concept of cultural intelligence. Soon Ang, a management professor at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University, has pioneered most of this work. She was working as a consultant for many international firms in the late 1990s when they asked her to put together a team of programmers from various nations to help them deal with the Y2K issue. The programmers were clearly smart and experienced, but Ang found that they were woefully inept at working together. For example, she discovered that Indian and Filipino programmers might appear to agree on a solution to a problem, only to implement it in incompatible ways. Despite the fact that the team members all spoke the same language, Ang saw that they were having difficulty bridging the cultural difference and understanding the varied ways of functioning. She devised a measure of cultural intelligence, CQ, that analyzes your general sensitivity to diverse cultural standards, partly inspired by Robert Sternberg's work. For instance, a British or American colleague could be astonished to submit an idea to Japanese colleagues only to be welcomed with silence. Someone with low cultural intelligence may misinterpret the reaction as a sign of apathy. Someone with high cultural intelligence would recognize that. In Japan, you may need to expressly ask for feedback before receiving a response, even if it is good. Consider the importance of small conversation in the development of a relationship. In some European countries, it's preferable to get right to the point. But in India, it's critical to spend the time to create relationships, something that someone with great cultural intelligence would recognize. Some people are consistently better at interpreting those cues than others, according to Ang. Importantly, cultural intelligence tests not just your knowledge of a given culture, but also your general sensitivity to potential misunderstandings in foreign places, as well as your ability to adapt to them. These tacit skills, like Sternberg's assessments of practical intelligence, don't have a good correlation with IQ or other academic aptitude tests, confirming the assumption that they are assessing distinct things. You can have excellent general intelligence, but lack cultural intelligence. As Ang's programmers demonstrated, CQ has now been linked to a variety of success indicators. It can forecast how quickly expats will adjust to their new lives, foreign salespeople's performance, and participants' negotiating skills. Beyond business, cultural intelligence may influence the experiences of international students, disaster relief workers, and teachers at international schools, or even your enjoyment of a vacation abroad. My discussions with Flynn and Sternberg left me speechless. Despite my academic accomplishments, I must admit that I lack many of the other abilities that Sternberg's exams assess, including many sorts of tacit knowledge that may be clear to some. Consider the situation when your employer is a micromanager who insists on having the last say on every project, a dilemma that many of us have faced. After speaking with Sternberg, I realized that someone with practical intelligence could subtly massage the micromanager's sense of self-importance by offering two solutions to a problem: the preferred solution and a decoy they could reject while still feeling like they had contributed to the project. It's a strategy I'd never considered before. Consider this scenario. You're a teacher, and you come across a group of children arguing in the playground. Do you chastise them or devise a simple diversion that will make them forget about their quarrel? The latter is second nature to my friend Emma, who teaches in an Oxford primary school. Her mind is full of games and subtle clues to influence their behavior. But when I tried to assist her in the classroom one day, I was completely lost, and the kids quickly outran me. This isn't rare for me, even if, like me, they scored higher than average on other intelligence measures and had years of expertise in the task at hand. A startling percentage of persons lacked this pragmatic judgment in Sternberg's tests of practical intelligence. However, the studies disagree on the exact relationship. At most, tacit knowledge measurements are only tangentially connected to IQ scores. At worst, they are adversely correlated. Some people simply seem to have an easier time learning the rules of pragmatic problem solving instinctively, and this skill is unrelated to general intelligence. For our purposes, counterfactual thinking, a type of creative intelligence that allows us to consider alternate outcomes to a scenario or envisage ourselves in a different circumstance, is also worth mentioning. It's the ability to ask what-if questions, and without it, you can find yourself helpless when confronted with a difficult situation. You'll struggle to learn from your failures and develop better solutions in the future if you can't reappraise your history. Again, most academic assessments overlook this. In this sense, Sternberg's theories assist us in comprehending the difficulties of clever individuals who struggle with some of the most basic duties of work, such as project planning, imagining the repercussions of their actions, and anticipating issues before they occur. One example is failed entrepreneurs. 9 out of 10 new company initiatives fail, frequently because the inventor has a wonderful idea, but lacks the capacity to deal with the problems of putting it into action. This behavior doesn't make much sense if we think that SATs or IQ tests reflect a unitary, fundamental mental energy, raw brain power that regulates all types of problem solving. Persons with high general intelligence should have picked up those skills. Sternberg's theory permits us to separate those other components and identify and measure them with scientific precision, demonstrating that they are mainly independent skills. These are crucial initial steps toward understanding why seemingly intelligent people may lack the sound judgment we might expect given their academic credentials. But this is only the beginning. In the following chapters, we'll learn about many other critical thinking styles and cognitive capabilities that psychologists have overlooked, as well as why, rather than sheltering us from error, higher intellect can often drive us to make even bigger ones. Sternberg's hypotheses are only the tip of the iceberg. Lewis Terman's life, in retrospect, exhibits several of these discoveries. He had always excelled academically since boyhood, rising from poor beginnings to become president of the American Psychological Association. We should also remember that he oversaw one of the first and most extensive cohort studies ever done, amassing reams of data that scientists are still studying 4 decades later. He was certainly a forward-thinking individual, yet it is now so simple to find obvious faults in his reasoning. Before coming to a conclusion, a competent scientist should leave no stone unturned. But Terman ignored data that might have contradicted his own views. He was so certain of the genetic nature of intelligence that he didn't bother looking for gifted children in poorer areas. And, although knowing that interfering in his subjects' lives would distort the results, he frequently provided financial assistance and professional advice to his termites, increasing their chances of success. He was ignoring the most fundamental, tacit understanding of the scientific method, which even the most unskilled undergraduate should assume. This isn't even taking into account his questionable political views. Terman's interest in social engineering led him to join the Human Betterment Foundation, which advocated for the forced sterilization of persons with undesirable characteristics. Furthermore, reading Terman's early articles reveals how quickly he rejected the intellectual capacity of African Americans and Hispanics based on a few case studies. Their dullness seems to be ethnic, or at least inherent in the familial stocks from which they originated, he said, describing the bad scores of just 2 Portuguese boys. He was confident that more research would uncover enormously huge racial inequalities and general IQ. Perhaps it is inappropriate to evaluate Terman by today's standards. Indeed, some psychologists argue that we should be forgiving of his flaws, as he was a product of his period. Except that we know Terman was exposed to opposing viewpoints. He must have read Bennett's reservations about his IQ test being abused. When Terman was questioned on these issues, he answered with knee-jerk fury rather than reasoned debate, which would have been a wiser man's response. Walter Lippmann, a journalist and political commentator, questioned the validity of the IQ test in a 1922 piece in the New Republic. It is impossible to conceive a more heinous act than to present a youngster with a set of puzzles, and, after an hour of monkeying with them, proclaim to the child, or to his parents, that here is a C individual, Lippmann wrote. Now it is plain that Mr. Lippmann has been seeing red. Furthermore, that seeing red is not very helpful to seeing clearly, Terman wrote in response. Clearly, something has smacked one of Mr. Lippmann's emotional complexes in the face. At the end of their lives, even the termites had begun to doubt the significance of their test results. Sarah Ann, the delightful little girl with an IQ of 192 who had bribed her experimenters with a gumdrop, was furious that she had not developed additional cognitive talents not assessed in her exam. My major regret is that, spurred on by my Terman group experience, my left-brain parents pretty much ignored any encouragement of any creative aptitude I might have had. She wrote, I now consider the latter area to be more important, and intelligence to be its handmaiden. I apologize for not noticing this 50 years ago. Terman's views softened with time, and he would later confess that intellect and achievement are far from perfectly associated. But his test scores continued to shape his perceptions of the people around him, even casting a pall over his familial connections. According to Terman's biographer, Henry Minton, each of his children and grandkids took the IQ test, and his feelings for them seemed to fluctuate depending on the findings. His letters were full of admiration for his son, Fred, a gifted engineer and early Silicon Valley pioneer. His daughter, Helen, was rarely mentioned. Doris' recollections of family dinners, during which the place settings were arranged in order of intelligence, are perhaps the most telling. Helen and her daughter Doris sat at the other end of the table, where they could assist the maid, while Fred sat at the head of the table close to Louis. Each family member was assigned a number based on a test they had taken years previously. Perhaps a hint of how Terman would have liked us all to be arranged. The dangers of disrationalia, 2 entangled arguments. On the beach in Atlantic City, New Jersey, 2 middle-aged guys, one short and squat, the other tall and ponderous with a walrus mustache, are sitting. They are Harry Houdini and Arthur Conan Doyle, one, and their friendship will never be the same again by the end of the evening. It all came to a head with a seance. Spiritualism was popular among London's upper crust, and Conan Doyle was a devout follower, attending 5 or 6 events every week. He further claimed that his wife, Jean, possessed psychic abilities, and that she had begun to channel a spirit guide named Phineas, who told them where to live and when to go. In contrast, Houdini was a skeptic, although he professed to have an open mind, and he had called Conan Doyle to discuss his latest book on the subject during a visit to England 2 years prior. Despite their disagreements, the two men immediately formed a tenuous friendship, and Houdini even consented to pay a visit to Conan Doyle's favorite medium, who claimed to be able to transport ectoplasm through her lips and vagina. He rejected her abilities as stage magic. I'll keep the details to myself. Conan Doyle was on a book tour in the United States at the time, and he invited Houdini to join him in Atlantic City. The meeting had started off well enough. Conan Doyle's boys had learned to dive with the help of Houdini, and the party was relaxing on the beach when Conan Doyle invited Houdini up to his hotel room for an impromptu seance, with Jean as the medium. He was aware that Houdini was grieving the loss of his mother, and he hoped that his wife would be able to communicate with the other side. So they went back to the Ambassador Hotel, shut the curtains, and waited for inspiration. As the men stood by and watched, Jean sat in a trance with a pencil in one hand. She then began to slam her hands against the table, indicating that the ghost had descended. "Do you believe in God?" she said of the spirit, who moved her hand to knock on the table once more. "Then I'll make the sign of the cross," she says. Her hand began to run quickly across the page as she sat with her pen poised over the writing pad. "Oh, my darling, thank God, I'm finally done," wrote the spirit. "I've tried so many times. Finally, I'm satisfied. Of course, I want to speak with my son, my own sweetheart. Friends, thank you from the bottom of my heart for this. You have answered my heart's cry." What about his? God's blessings on him. Jean had written roughly 20 pages in Angular, irregular script by the end of the seance. Her husband was completely enchanted. It was a bizarre scene, my wife's fingers flying madly across the table as she scrawled furiously, and me sitting across from her, ripping sheet after sheet from the block as it was filled up. Houdini, on the other hand, pierced the ruse with a series of probing inquiries. Why had his Jewish mother purported to be a Christian? How had this Hungarian immigrant managed to write faultless English, a language she had never learned? And why didn't she bring up the fact that it was her birthday? In a later article for the New York Sun, Houdini expressed his skepticism. It was the beginning of a public spat between the two men, and their friendship never fully healed before the escapologist's death 4 years later. Even yet, Conan Doyle was unable to put the matter to rest. In a piece for the Strand magazine, presumably encouraged by his spirit guide Phineas, he attempted to answer and reject all of Houdini's reservations. His logic was more fantastical than any of his fictional works, not least when he claimed to be in command of a dematerializing and reconstructing power that allowed him to slip in and out of bonds. Is it conceivable for a guy to be a very powerful medium for the rest of his life, to utilize that capacity on a regular basis, and never realize that the gifts he is using are those that the world refers to as mediumship? He penned, "If that is the case, we have a solution to the Houdini mystery. If you had met these two guys for the first time, you might have assumed Conan Doyle was the more critical thinker. He exemplified the abstract reasoning that Terman was only beginning to evaluate with his IQ tests. He was a doctor of medicine and a best-selling author, a professional illusionist, a Hungarian immigrant whose education stopped at the age of 12, was the only one who could see through the ruse. Some observers have questioned whether Conan Doyle was insane, but it's worth remembering that many of his contemporaries, including scientists like physicist Oliver Lodge, whose work on electromagnetic gave us the radio, and naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, a contemporary of Charles Darwin who independently invented the theory of natural selection, Both were great intellectual personalities, but they were deafeningly deaf. We've already seen how we might broaden our definition of intelligence to encompass both practical and creative reasoning, that those theories don't look at human rationality, which is described as our ability to make the best judgments for our goals given the resources we have, and to establish opinions based on evidence, logic, and solid reasoning. Keith Stanovich, a cognitive scientist, describes two types of rationality. Instrumental rationality is defined as the optimization of someone's goal fulfillment, or, to put it another way, behaving in such a way that you receive exactly what you want, given the resources at hand. While epistemic rationality is concerned with how well your beliefs map onto the actual structure of the world, epistemic rationality is concerned with how well your beliefs map onto the actual structure of the world. Conan Doyle certainly lacked the latter by falling for bogus mediums. While decades of psychological research have recorded humanity's more irrational tendencies, scientists have only lately begun to analyze how that irrationality differs between individuals and whether that variance is related to IQ tests. They're discovering that the two aren't perfectly correlated. It's conceivable to have a high SAT score that reflects outstanding abstract thinking but still perform poorly on these new rationality tests, a mismatch known as dysrationalia. Conan Doyle's personal story, and, in particular, his association with Houdini, provides the ideal prism through which to examine this cutting-edge study. I don't believe that any type of faith is fundamentally illogical, but I am intrigued by the fact that con artists were able to use Conan Doyle's beliefs to deceive him time and time again. He was absolutely deafeningly, whatever your feelings about paranormal believing in general. He didn't need to be so trusting at such a high cost to himself. Conan Doyle is especially noteworthy because we know from his literature that he was well versed in logical deduction laws. Indeed, he began dabbling in spiritualism around the same time he was creating Sherlock Holmes, for he was conjuring up literature's greatest scientific mind during the day, but failed to apply his deductive talents at night. His intelligence, if anything, seems to have encouraged him to come up with increasingly innovative justifications to dismiss the skeptics and justify his convictions. He was chained in his chains more securely than Houdini, any other renowned intellectuals of the last century, in addition to Doyle, may have fallen victim to this type of intelligence trap. Even Einstein, whose theories are frequently regarded as the pinnacle of human brilliance, may have been affected by this distorted reasoning, resulting in a run of embarrassing failures throughout the last 25 years of his career. Whatever your circumstances and interests, this research will explain why so many of us make mistakes that are blindingly obvious to everyone else, and why we continue to make those mistakes long after the facts have become clear. Houdini appears to have intuitively grasped the intelligence mind's susceptibility. I've found that the bigger a man's brain is and the more he's educated, the easier it is to mystify him, he reportedly told Conan Doyle. 5. The idea of dysrationalia and its potential for harm has been around for decades, but its origins can be traced back to two Israeli psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who identified various cognitive biases and heuristics, quick and easy rules of thumb that can skew our reasoning. One of their most startling studies had participants spin a wheel of fortune, which landed on a number between 1 and 100. Before answering general knowledge questions like calculating the number of African countries represented at the United Nations. Of course, the Wheel of Fortune should have had no bearing on their responses. Yet it had a significant impact. The smaller their estimate, the lower the quantity on the wheel. The arbitrary value had imprinted a figure in their minds, anchoring their judgment. Many times while shopping in the sales, You have undoubtedly fell for anchoring yourself. Assume you're in the market for a new television. You were expecting to pay roughly £100, but then you come across a great steal. A £200 item for £150. When you see the original amount, it anchors your impression of what is a reasonable price to spend, which means you will exceed your initial budget. If you hadn't seen the original price, on the other hand, you would have probably dismissed it as too expensive and went on. You may have also fallen victim to the availability heuristic, which allows us to exaggerate the severity of particular threats based on how quickly they spring to mind due to their vividness. It's why many people are more concerned about flying than driving. Tales of plane crashes are typically considerably more emotional, despite the reality that getting into a car is far more perilous. There's also framing, which refers to the possibility of changing your mind based on how information is presented. Assume you're investigating a medical treatment for 600 people suffering from a fatal condition that has a 1 in 3 chance of working. You can be told that this treatment will save 200 people. The gain framing, or that this treatment will kill 400 people. The loss framing. People are more likely to affirm the statement when it is delivered in the gain framing. They passively accept the facts as they are offered to them without questioning their meaning. Advertisers have long understood this. It's why we're informed that meals are 95% fat-free, rather than just 5% fat. The sunk cost fallacy, our reluctance to abandon a failing investment even if we will lose more attempting to keep it going. And the gambler's fallacy, the idea that if the roulette wheel has landed on black, it will most likely land on red the next time, are 2 other significant biases. Of course, the chance remains unchanged. At 1913, in Monte Carlo, an extreme incidence of the gambler's fallacy is believed to have occurred when the roulette wheel fell 26 times on black, and the visitors lost millions as the bets on red increased. However, it is not only seen in casinos. It may also have an impact on family planning. Many parents mistakenly believe that if they have previously had a series of males, a daughter will be the next in line. They might wind up with an entire football team of lads if they follow this approach. Many cognitive scientists divide our thinking into 2 groups based on these findings. System 1, intuitive, automatic, quick thinking, which may be susceptible to unconscious biases, and System 2, slow, more analytical, deliberate thinking. Many of our erroneous decisions, according to dual process theory, occur when we depend too much on System 1, allowing biases to obscure our judgment. However, none of Kahneman and Tversky's early experiments looked into whether our irrationality differed from person to person. Is it true that certain persons are more sensitive to these prejudices than others? For example, what is the relationship between these traits and our general intelligence? Conan Doyle's narrative is startling since we intuitively expect more intellectual people to act more logically, given their better analytical minds. Yet, as Tversky and Kahneman demonstrated, our intuitions can be deceiving. These are crucial questions to answer if we want to understand why smart people do stupid things. Keith Stanovich, a Canadian psychologist, decided to tackle these issues head-on during a sabbatical at the University of Cambridge in 1991. He had long been interested in the ways that some mental abilities may lag behind others, and he suspected that rationality would be no different. He had a wife who specialized in learning difficulties, so he had long been interested in the ways that some mental abilities may lag behind others. As a result, an influential paper was published, introducing the concept of dysrationalia as a direct parallel to dyslexia and dyscalculia. It was a provocative idea, intended as a nudge in the ribs for all bias researchers. Stanovich told me I wanted to jolt the field into realizing that it had been ignoring individual differences. Irrationalia, according to Stanovich, is not limited to system thinking. even if we are self-aware enough to recognize when our intuitions are incorrect and override them. We may lack the necessary mindware, the knowledge and attitudes that should enable us to reason correctly. If you grow up in a family that distrusts scientists, for example, you may develop a tendency to disregard empirical evidence in favor of unproven theories. Greater intelligence wouldn't necessarily prevent you from forming those attitudes in the first place. And it's even possible that your increased learning capacity would lead to you accumulating an increasing number of facts to back up your beliefs. This rationalia appears to be common based on circumstantial evidence. According to a study conducted by the High IQ Society Mensa, 44% of its members believed in astrology, and 56% believed the Earth had been visited by extraterrestrials. However, rigorous experiments examining the relationship between intelligence and rationality were lacking. Stanovich has spent the last 2 decades using a series of carefully controlled experiments to build on those foundations. We'll need some basic statistical theory to comprehend his findings. The relationship between 2 variables is usually expressed as a correlation coefficient between 0 and 1 in psychology and other sciences. A perfect correlation would be 1. The 2 parameters would essentially be measuring the same thing. This is unrealistic for most studies of human health and behavior, which are influenced by so many variables. But many scientists consider a moderate correlation to be between 0.4 and 0.59. Stanovich discovered that the links between rationality and intelligence were generally weak using these measures. For example, SAT scores had only a 0.1 to 0.19 correlation with measures of framing bias and anchoring. Intelligence also appeared to play a minor role in whether we are willing to forego immediate gratification in exchange for a larger future reward, a phenomenon known as temporal discounting. The correlation with SAT scores was as low as 0.02 in one test. That's a surprisingly low correlation for a trait that many people associate with having a more analytical mind. In another study, the sunk cost bias had almost no correlation with SAT scores. Meanwhile, Gui Zhu and colleagues from Beijing Normal University have followed Stanovich's lead, discovering that the gambler's fallacy is slightly more prevalent among the more academically successful participants in his sample. It's important to remember this when playing roulette. You're not smarter than the wheel. Even the most well-versed philosophers are vulnerable. Participants with PhDs in philosophy, for example, are just as likely as everyone else to be affected by framing effects, despite the fact that they should have been taught logical reasoning. At the very least, more intelligent people should be able to recognize these flaws. In reality, most people believe they are less vulnerable than others, and the smarter participants are no exception. Indeed, Stanovich discovered that people with higher SAT scores had a slightly larger bias blind spot than people who were less academically gifted in one set of experiments looking at some of the classic cognitive biases. Adults with higher cognitive abilities are aware of their intellectual status and expect to outperform others on the majority of cognitive tasks. Stanovich explained, they expect to outperform on these cognitive biases because they are presented to them as essentially cognitive tasks. I get the impression from my interactions with Stanovich that he is very cautious about publicizing his findings, which means he hasn't achieved the same level of fame as, say, Daniel Kahneman, but colleagues in his field believe that these theories could be truly game-changing. Some of the most important research in cognitive psychology has been done by him, but it is sometimes underappreciated, said Gordon Pennycook, a professor at the University of Regina in Canada who has also studied human rationality. Many of these measures have now been refined and combined by Stanovich into a single test known as the rationality quotient. He emphasizes that his goal is not to devalue intelligence tests, which he says work quite well for what they do, but rather to improve our understanding of the other cognitive skills that may influence our decision-making and to put them on an equal footing with existing measures of cognitive ability. In his scholarly book on the subject, he wrote, "Our goal has always been to give the concept of rationality a fair hearing, almost as if it had been proposed prior to intelligence. It's a great irony," he says, "that the thinking skills explored in Kahneman's Nobel Prize-winning work are still ignored in our most well-known cognitive ability test." The first iteration of the comprehensive assessment of rational thinking was published at the end of 2016 after years of careful development and verification of the various subtests. It included questionnaires about contaminated mindware, such as anti-science attitudes, as well as measures of common cognitive biases and heuristics. It also included probabilistic and statistical reasoning skills, such as the ability to assess risk, that could improve our rationality. Consider the following question, which is intended to test the belief bias. Your task is to determine whether the conclusion follows logically from the first two premises alone. Water is essential for all living things. Water is required for roses. As a result, roses are living creatures. What did you say in response? 70% of university students believe this is a valid argument, according to Stanovich's research. But it isn't, because the first premise only states that all living things require water, not that all living things require water. Compare it to the following statements if you still don't see why that makes sense. All insects require oxygen to survive. Mice require oxygen to survive. As a result, mice are insects. The logic in both statements is identical, but it's much easier to spot the flaw in the reasoning when the conclusion contradicts your prior knowledge. To avoid thinking that the argument is correct just because the conclusion makes sense with what you already know. In the first example, you must set aside your preconceptions and think carefully and critically about the specific statements at hand. This is a crucial skill to have when evaluating a new claim. Stanovich discovered that when all of these subtests were combined, the overall correlation with measures of general intelligence, such as SAT scores, was modest, 0.47 on one test. Some overlap was inevitable, given that several of these tests, such as probabilistic reasoning, would be aided by mathematical ability and other aspects of cognition assessed by IQ tests and SATs. But that still leaves room for the rationality-intelligence mismatches that lead to smart people acting foolishly. Stanovich said, "The rationality quotient could be used in recruitment to evaluate the quality of a potential employee's decision-making with further development." Stanovich told me that he has already received significant interest from law firms, financial institutions, and executive head hunters. Stanovich hopes that his test will be useful in determining how students' reasoning evolves over the course of a school or university course. To me, this would be one of the more exciting applications, Stanovich said. With that information, you could look into which interventions are most effective in helping people develop more rational thinking styles. Cynics may question whether RQ truly reflects our behavior in real life, while we wait to see it in action. After all, the IQ test has a reputation for being overly abstract. Is RQ, which is based on fictitious scenarios, any different? Wandi Bruijn de Bruin's research at Leeds University has provided some preliminary answers. Stanovich's research inspired her team to create their own adult decision-making competence scale, which consists of 7 tasks that assess biases such as framing, risk perception, and the tendency to fall prey to the sunk cost fallacy, whether you are likely to continue with a bad investment or not. The researchers also looked at overconfidence by asking the participants a series of general knowledge questions and then asking them to rate their confidence in each answer. Unlike many psychological studies, which use university students as test subjects, Bruijn de Bruin's experiment looked at a diverse group of people ranging in age from 18 to 88, with a variety of educational backgrounds, allowing her to ensure that any findings were representative of the general population. The participants' decision-making skills were only moderately related to their intelligence. According to Stanovich's tests, academic success did not necessarily make them more rational decision makers. Bruijn de Bruijn, on the other hand, decided to see how both measures were related to their real-world behavior. To do so, she asked participants to declare how often they had experienced various stressful life events, ranging from the relatively minor, such as getting sunburned or missing a flight, to the serious, catching an STD or cheating on your partner, and the downright awful, getting sunburned or missing a flight, and the downright awful, getting sunburned or missing a flight, being put in jail. The participants' rationality scores were about 3 times more important in determining their behavior than their general intelligence scores, which appeared to have a small effect on these outcomes. These tests clearly capture a more general tendency to be a careful, considered thinker that was not reflected in more traditional measures of cognitive ability. You can be intelligent and irrational, as Stanovich discovered, and this has serious life consequences. The findings of Bruijn de Bruijn can provide us with some insight into other unusual habits of intelligent people. People with higher IQs are more likely to drink more alcohol, and may be more likely to smoke or use illegal drugs, according to a 2010 study from the London School of Economics, proving that intelligence does not always help us weigh short-term benefits against long-term consequences. High IQ individuals are also more likely to experience financial difficulties, such as missed mortgage payments, bankruptcy, or credit card debt, in comparison to 8.3% of people with an average IQ of 100. Around 14% of people with an IQ of 140 had reached their credit limit. They were also no more likely to put money into long-term investments or savings. Their accumulated wealth was only a fraction higher each year. These findings are especially surprising given that more intelligent and better educated people tend to have more stable jobs with higher salaries, implying that their financial distress is the result of their decisions rather than a lack of earning power. According to the researchers, more intelligent people err on the side of the financial precipice, believing that they will be better able to deal with the consequences later. Whatever the reason, the findings suggest that smarter people aren't investing their money in the more rational way that economists would expect. It's yet another sign that intelligence doesn't always imply better decision-making. Consider the story of Paul Frampton as an example. His work varied from a novel hypothesis of dark matter, the enigmatic, invisible material that holds our cosmos together, to the prediction of a subatomic particle called the Axigluon, a theory that is inspiring studies at the Large Hadron Collider. In 2011, he began online dating and quickly formed a friendship with Denise Milani, a former bikini model. She persuaded him to join her on a photo shoot in La Paz, Bolivia, in January of the following year. When he arrived, however, he discovered a telegram informing him that she had been forced to leave for Argentina instead. She had, however, forgotten her suitcase. Is he able to pick it up and deliver it to her? Unfortunately, when he landed in Argentina, Milani was nowhere to be found. He had had enough of waiting and decided to return to the United States, where he checked her suitcase beside his own. A few minutes later, he was summoned to his gate by an announcement from the airport employees. You can probably imagine what happened next unless you have severe dysrationalia yourself. He was accused with smuggling 2 kilograms of cocaine after that. Fraudsters had been posing as Milani, who is a legitimate model who was unaware of the scheme and had never communicated with Frampton. They would almost certainly have intercepted the bag once he had crossed the border. The relationship had been cautioned to Frampton. In the New York Times, John Dixon, a fellow physicist and friend of Frampton, said, "I thought he was out of his mind, and I told him so." However, he was certain that he had a lovely young lady who wanted to marry him. We'll never know what was going on in Frampton's head. Perhaps he suspected Milani of being involved in a drug smuggling ring, and thought this would be a good opportunity to prove himself to her. His affection for her seemed to have been genuine, as he attempted to contact her after the hoax was discovered. However, for some reason, he had been unable to analyze the hazards and had been misled by impetuous, wishful thinking. Returning to the Atlantic City seance, Arthur Conan Doyle's actions appear to match perfectly with ideas of dysrationalia, providing persuasive evidence that paranormal and superstitious beliefs are surprisingly frequent among the extremely educated. People with college degrees are just as likely as those without to believe in UFOs, and they are even more skeptical of extrasensory perception and psychic healing, according to a survey of over 1,200 participants. While the education level is an imperfect indicator of intelligence, it does suggest that the abstract thinking and information required to reach university does not translate into more sensible beliefs. Despite the fact that all of the following events have been consistently disproven by respectable scientists, it appears that many intelligent individuals continue to believe in them. This could simply be due to cognitive miserliness. According to dual process, fast, slow thinking theories, rather than reasoning analytically and critically, people who believe in the paranormal rely on their gut sensations and intuitions to think about the sources of their views. This may be true for many people with nebulous, undefined views, but there are other aspects of Conan Doyle's biography that show his actions aren't so easily explained. He appeared to be utilizing analytical reasoning from System 2 to rationalize his ideas and ignore the facts on several occasions. He was overthinking it rather than underthinking it. Consider the famous case of Conan Doyle being duped by two schoolgirls, Elsie Wright, 16, and Frances Griffith, 9, claimed to have photographed a community of fairies frolicking around a brook in Cottingley, West Yorkshire, in 1917, a few years before he met Houdini. Conan Doyle received the photographs through a connection at the local Theosophical Society. Many of his friends were skeptical, but he was taken in by the girls' story hook, line, and sinker. In The Coming of Fairies, he stated, "It is difficult for the intellect to understand what the ultimate results may be if we have genuinely confirmed the existence on the surface of this planet of a population which may be as numerous as the human race." They were, in fact, cardboard cutouts from Princess Mary's gift book, which also contained some of Conan Doyle's own writing. It's not so much that he fell for the fairies in the first place that fascinates me, but the remarkable lengths to which he went to dispel any concerns. You can even see hatpins keeping one of the cutouts together if you look closely at the photos. There were others saw pins. He saw the gnome's belly button, proof that fairies are connected to their mothers by an umbilical cord while in the womb. Conan Doyle even attempted to use recent scientific discoveries to explain the fairies' existence, claiming that they were made of material that emitted shorter or longer vibrations, rendering them invisible to humans. According to electromagnetic theory, Conan Doyle exploited his brains and wit to dismiss any counter-arguments, was able to use his smarts to outsmart himself, says Ray Hyman, a psychology professor at the University of Oregon. The use of System 2 slow thinking to rationalize our beliefs even when they are incorrect leads to the discovery of the most important and pervasive form of the intelligence trap, with numerous disastrous consequences. It can explain not only the folly of people like Conan Doyle, but also the vast political divides on issues like gun crime and climate change. So, what's the science behind it? The first hints came from a series of classic studies conducted by Harvard University's David Perkins in the 1970s and 1980s, in which students were asked to ponder a range of topical topics such as, would a nuclear disarmament deal lower the likelihood of world war? Although a fully reasonable thinker should evaluate both sides of an argument, Perkins discovered that more brilliant pupils were no more inclined to do so. Someone who supports nuclear disarmament, for example, may not consider the problem of trust, whether we can be certain that all countries will adhere to the deal. Instead, they had merely employed their abstract thinking abilities and factual knowledge to provide more intricate reasons for their own point of view. Although this tendency is commonly referred to as confirmation bias, other psychologists, like Perkins, prefer to refer to it as Smithside bias, which encompasses a wide range of strategies we might employ to reinforce our point of view while dismissing opposing viewpoints. Even student lawyers, who are specifically instructed to consider the opposing side of a legal argument, did not fare well. Perkins later regarded this as one of his most significant breakthroughs. Thinking about the other side of the case is an excellent illustration of effective reasoning. He said, "How come student lawyers with high IQs and training in reasoning that includes anticipating the opposition's arguments are just as susceptible to confirmation bias, or my side bias, as it's been dubbed?" Asking such a question raises fundamental difficulties concerning intelligence notions. Later research only confirmed this finding, and this one-sided approach of thinking appears to be especially problematic when it comes to matters concerning our sense of self. This type of emotionally charged, self-protective usage of our thinking is now referred to as motivated reasoning by scientists. Apart from the my side, confirmation bias studied by Perkins, in which we preferentially seek and remember information that confirms our point of view. Motivated reasoning can also take the shape of a disconfirmation bias, a type of preferential skepticism that debunks alternative arguments. And, taken collectively, they have the potential to make us grow increasingly entrenched in our beliefs. Consider Dan Kahan's experiment at Yale Law School, which looked at people's attitudes toward gun legislation. He told his audience that a local government was debating whether or not to prohibit the carrying of firearms in public, and that it was unclear if this would increase or decrease crime rates. So they gathered information on towns with and without these restrictions, as well as variations in crime over the course of a year. Kahan also administered a regular numeracy test to his participants and interrogated them about their political beliefs. It's worth a shot. Do the bans operate in light of this information? Kahan had purposefully designed the data to appear deceptive at first look, implying a massive drop in crime in the cities that had enacted the ban. To arrive at the correct answer, evaluate the statistics, which reveal that roughly 25% of cities with the ban had a rise in crime, compared to only 16% of those without the ban. To put it another way, the ban was ineffective. The more numerate participants, as one might expect, were more likely to reach that conclusion, but only if they were more conservative Republican voters who were already more likely to reject gun control. The participants, regardless of their IQ, bypassed the explicit calculation if they were liberal Democrat voters, and were more inclined to go with their incorrect initial feeling that the ban had worked. In the interest of justice, Kahan repeated the experiment with the data reversed, resulting in results that supported the prohibition. Now, numerate liberals were more likely to get it correctly, whereas numerate conservatives were more likely to get it incorrect. Overall, the participants who were the most numerate were roughly 45% more likely to read the data properly if it matched their expectations. According to Kahan and other motivated reasoning researchers, brilliant people do not use their superior intelligence equitably, but rather opportunistically promote their own interests and defend the beliefs that are most important to their identities. Instead of seeking the truth, intelligence can be used to spread misinformation. It's a significant result that helps to understand why there's so much polarization on matters like climate change. The scientific consensus is that human-caused carbon emissions cause global warming, and those with liberal politics are more likely to accept this message if they have stronger numeracy abilities and a basic understanding of science. This makes sense because these people are more likely to comprehend the evidence. The contrary is true among free market capitalists. The more scientifically competent and numerate they are, the more likely they are to reject the scientific consensus and believe that climate change claims are overstated. People's opinions on immunization, fracking, and evolution are all polarized in the same way. Greater education and intelligence merely assist people in justifying their ideas that correspond to their political, social, or religious identities in each circumstance. To be clear, overwhelming evidence supports the safety and effectiveness of vaccines, the fact that carbon emissions are changing the climate, and the fact that evolution is correct. There's also evidence that, thanks to motivated reasoning, exposing people to opposing viewpoints can backfire. Not only do people reject the counter-arguments, but their own beliefs become even more entrenched. To put it another way, a knowledgeable individual with an incorrect belief system may become even more ignorant after hearing the truth. Republicans' views on Obamacare in 2009 and 2010 demonstrated this. People with higher intelligence were more likely to believe claims that the new system would create Orwellian death panels to decide who lived and died, and their beliefs were only reinforced when evidence was presented to dispel the myths. Hand's study has focused on the importance of motivated reasoning in political decision-making, where there may be no right or wrong solution, but he believes it might be applied to other types of believing as well. He cites a research by Jonathan Kohler, then at the University of Texas at Austin, in which he provided findings from 2 fictional extrasensory perception tests to parapsychologists and skeptics. The participants should have evaluated the papers and the study design objectively. However, according to Kohler, they typically came to radically different conclusions depending on whether the findings of the investigations coincided or contradicted with their own paranormal views. Conan Doyle's belief in fraudulent mediums appears less odd when we examine the strength of motivated reasoning. His very identity had become entwined with his paranormal research. He had invested significant sums of money in a spiritualist church and published more than 20 books and pamphlets on the subject. Spiritualism was the cornerstone of his relationship with his wife and many of his friendships. His belief supplied him with the soothing certainty of the hereafter as he grew older. It completely eliminates any fear of death, he added, and the belief linked him to people he had already lost. 2 of the most powerful incentives imaginable. All of this appears to be in line with research suggesting that beliefs may emerge from emotional demands initially, with the mind intervening only later to rationalize the sentiments. However odd they may be, Conan Doyle made a point of claiming objectivity. I never missed an opportunity to read, research, or experiment on this issue in these 41 years. He boasted near the conclusion of his life. However, he was only interested in evidence that supported his point of view, and ignored everything else. It didn't matter that this was the intellect behind Sherlock Holmes, the perfect reasoning and observation machine. Conan Doyle could simply use the same imagination to explain away Houdini's skepticism, thanks to motivated reasoning. And when he viewed the images of the Cottingley fairies, he thought he'd unearthed proof that would persuade the world that additional psychic phenomena exist. In his ecstasy, his imagination concocted intricate scientific theories, without stopping to consider whether it was simply a schoolgirl joke. The girls admitted that they hadn't bargained for grown-ups' desire to be duped when they confessed decades after Conan Doyle's death. In a 1985 interview, one of the girls, Frances Griffiths, said, "I never even thought of it as being a hoax. It was just Elsie and me having a good time. And I'm still baffled as to why they were taken in. They wanted to be taken in." Houdini lost all respect for Conan Doyle after their increasingly public feud. He had begun the friendship believing the writer was an intellectual giant, and concluded it saying that one must be half-witted to accept some of these things, given what we know about motivated thinking. However, the inverse may be true Only an intellectual giant could believe such things. Heath Stenovich points out in his book The Rationality Quotient that George Orwell famously came to the same conclusion when describing various forms of nationalism, writing, "There is no limit to the follies that can be swallowed if one is under the influence of feelings of this kind. No ordinary man could be such a fool. Any other brilliant minds may have perished as a result of their narrow thinking. Even if their errors were not caused by ghosts or fairies, they nonetheless resulted in years of lost effort and disappointment as they tried to defend the indefensible. Take, for example, Albert Einstein, whose name has become synonymous with genius. In 1905, when still a young patent clerk, he laid the groundwork for quantum mechanics, special relativity, and the mass energy equivalence equation, E equals mc2, for which he is best known. He would announce his theory of general relativity a decade later, shattering Isaac Newton's laws of gravity. His ambitions, however, did not end there. He intended to spend the rest of his life working on a bigger, all-encompassing theory of the cosmos that combined the forces of electromagnetic and gravity into a single, unified theory. I'd like to know how God made the world. He had earlier said, "I am not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know his ideas." And this was his attempt to convey his thoughts in their totality. He believed he had done it after a spell of illness in 1928. "I've laid a fantastic egg," he wrote, "whether the bird that emerges from this will be viable and long-lived is in the hands of the gods. That the gods murdered that bird, and over the next 25 years, there would be many more crushed expectations, with more announcements of a new unified theory, only for them all to fall like a dead weight." Einstein had to declare shortly before his death that most of my progeny end up very early in the graveyard of dashed hopes. Those surrounding Einstein, on the other hand, were not surprised by his failures. In his book Einstein's Mistakes, his biographer, physicist Hans Ohanian, wrote, "Einstein's entire enterprise was an exercise in futility. It was outmoded from the outset. However, the more he invested in the thesis, the more he resisted abandoning it." Freeman Dyson, a Princeton colleague, was reputedly so embarrassed by Einstein's hazy thinking that he avoided him on campus for 8 years. The issue was that Einstein's vaunted intuition, which had served him so well in 1905, had led him wrong, and he had grown deaf and blind to anything that would contradict his theories. He dismissed evidence of nuclear forces that contradicted his grand theory, for example, and grew to loathe quantum theory, a discipline he had previously helped to build. He would spend all day at scientific meetings trying to come up with progressively complex counterexamples to disprove his opponents, only to be disproved by the evening. According to his Princeton colleague Robert Oppenheimer, he just turned his back on tests and sought to rid himself of the facts. As he neared the end of his life, Einstein realized this. He once remarked to his buddy, quantum physicist Louis de Broglie, that he must appear like an ostrich who buries its head in the relativistic sand to avoid facing the evil quanta. But even as the final flames of his genius waned, he went on his fool's errand, scribbling pages of equations to justify his erroneous notions. All of this sounds a lot like motivated reasoning exacerbating the sunk cost fallacy. Many of his other views are characterized by the same obstinacy. He turned a blind eye to the flaws of the USSR. For example, since he embraced communism, at the very least, Einstein had not strayed from his field of expertise. But, as psychologist Hans Eysenck pointed out, this single-minded zeal to show oneself right may be especially harmful when scientists venture outside their regular zone. Scientists are just as ordinary, pig-headed, and irrational as everyone else, especially when they leave the particular subject in which they are specialized, he wrote in the 1950s, and their extraordinarily high intelligence simply adds to the danger of their preconceptions. The irony is that Eysenck himself came to believe in paranormal hypotheses, demonstrating the skewed examination of data that he claimed to condemn. Nobel disease is a term used by certain science journalists to criticize Nobel Prize winners' unfortunate habit of adopting dubious opinions on numerous problems. The most famous case is, of course, Kary Mullis, the great biochemist who we met in the introduction and who has bizarre conspiracy notions. Dancing Naked in the Mind Field, his autobiography, is nearly a textbook on the twisted justifications the clever mind can concoct to justify its prejudices. Other examples include Linus Pauling, who discovered the nature of chemical bonds between atoms, but spent decades falsely claiming that vitamin supplements could cure cancer, and Luc Montagnier, who helped discover the HIV virus, but has since espoused some bizarre theories about how even highly diluted DNA can cause structural changes in water, causing it to emit electromagnetic radiation, which Montagnier believes can be linked to autism, Alzheimer's disease, and other neurological disorders. Even if we aren't working on a grand unified theory, we can all learn something from this. Regardless of your career, the toxic combination of motivated reasoning and the bias blind spot can still drive us to explain prejudiced ideas about others, labor on failed projects, or rationalize a hopeless love affair. Let's look at two of history's greatest innovators, Thomas Edison and Steve Jobs, as final examples. With over 1,000 patents under his belt, Thomas Edison certainly possessed an exceptionally fertile mind. However, once he had a thought, he found it difficult to modify his mind, as seen by the War of the Currents. After inventing the first functional electric lighting in the late 1880s, Thomas Edison set out to discover a means to power America's homes. His plan was to create a power grid based on a constant direct current, DC, but his competitor George Westinghouse had discovered a cheaper way to transport electricity using the alternating current, AC we use today. Whereas DC is a single voltage flat line, AC oscillates fast between two voltages, preventing energy loss over long distances. AC, according to Edison, was simply too risky, as it was more likely to result in electrocuted death. Although this was a valid issue, the risk could be mitigated with proper insulation and restrictions, and the economic justifications were simply too compelling to ignore. It was the only practical option to give power to the masses. Rather than pursuing DC, the reasonable approach would have been to try to capitalize on the new technology and improve its safety. Nikola Tesla, one of Edison's own engineers, had already informed him of this. Instead of following Tesla's suggestion, Edison ignored his ideas and even refused to pay him for his AC research, prompting Tesla to take his ideas to Westinghouse instead. Edison, refusing to accept defeat, waged an increasingly furious public relations campaign to sway public opinion against AC. It started with gruesome public displays of electrocuting stray dogs and horses. When Edison learned that a New York court was looking into the potential of utilizing electricity for executions, he saw another chance to establish his argument by advising the court on the invention of the electric chair, in the hopes that AC would forever be connected with death. For someone who had previously stated that he would join heartily in an attempt to completely eliminate capital punishment, it was a striking moral sacrifice. You can dismiss them as the tactics of a cutthroat businessman, but the war was ultimately useless. It is impossible now for any man, or body of men, to halt the course of alternating current development. Joshua may tell the sun to stand still, but Mr. Edison is not Joshua, wrote one journal in 1889. He had to confess defeat by the 1890s, and he eventually moved on to other endeavors. The question is not so much why Edison's effort failed, as why he felt it might succeed, argues Mark Essig, a scientific historian. However, understanding cognitive errors like the sunk cost effect, bias blind spot, and motivated reasoning might help explain why such a clever mind could persuade itself to continue down such a bad road. Steve Jobs, Apple's co-founder, was a guy of immense intelligence and imagination, but he, too, suffered from a dangerously warped vision of the world at times. In the words of his former colleague Andy Hertzfeld, Walter Isaacson's contemporaries described him as having a reality distortion field, a baffling melange of charismatic rhetorical style, indomitable drive, and desire to bend any fact to meet the goal at hand. Jobs' unwavering commitment helped him revolutionize technology, but it sometimes backfired in his personal life, especially after he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2003. Instead of following his doctor's recommendations, he turned to quack therapies like herbal remedies, spiritual healing, and a rigorous fruit juice diet. Jobs had convinced himself, according to everyone around him, that he could cure his cancer himself, and his incredible intelligence seems to have allowed him to reject any other viewpoints. The cancer had advanced too far to be treated by the time he finally underwent surgery, and some physicians believe Jobs could still be alive today if he had merely followed medical advice. Rather than logic and reason, more intellect is used in each case for rationalization and justification. We've now seen 3 broad reasons why a smart person might do something stupid. They may lack creative or practical intelligence, which is necessary for dealing with life's challenges. They may suffer from dysrationalia, in which they make decisions based on biased, intuitive judgments. And, thanks to motivated reasoning, they may use their intelligence to dismiss any evidence that contradicts their beliefs. This last kind of the intelligence trap was best explained to me by Harvard University's David Perkins, who likened it to building a moat around a fortress. Meanwhile, author Michael Shermer characterizes it as establishing logic-tight enclaves in our minds. However, I like to conceive of it as a speeding car that lacks the necessary steering or navigation to correct its route. Those who go forward but very slowly can gain further, if they constantly follow the proper road, than those who are in too much of a hurry and veer off it. As Descartes expressed it originally, whatever metaphor you use, evolutionary psychologists are perplexed as to why we developed in this manner. They assume typical behaviors to have had a demonstrable benefit to our survival when they construct their theories of human nature. Yet how might being bright but irrational ever be advantageous? Hugo Mercier of the French National Center for Scientific Research and Dan Sperber of the Central European University in Budapest have recently published a compelling solution. I think psychologists have forgotten how strange the mycide bias is because it's now so clear, Mercier said me in an interview. However, from an evolutionary standpoint, it is extremely maladaptive. Human intellect evolved, at least in part, to deal with the cognitive demands of governing more complex civilizations. It is now largely believed our predecessors' skull size did definitely rise when they began to dwell in larger groupings, as evidenced by the archaeological record. We require brain power to keep track of other people's emotions, to determine who to trust, who to avoid, and who to keep sweet. And when language evolved, we needed to be eloquent in order to gain support within the group and persuade others to adopt our viewpoint. To offer us those benefits, those arguments didn't have to be logical. They just had to be persuasive. And it's possible that this minor distinction explains why irrationality and intelligence frequently go hand in hand. Consider the mycide bias and motivated thinking. If the goal of human cognition is to find the truth, we should carefully consider both sides of a debate. However, if we just wish to persuade others that we are correct, we will appear more persuasive if we can gather as much information as possible to support our position. To prevent being fooled, we must be especially skeptical of others' arguments, and we must pay special attention to probing and disputing any data that contradicts our own ideas, as Kahan demonstrated. In other words, Biased reasoning may not only be an unwanted side consequence of our increasing brain power, it could be its raison d'etre. Good arguments should have countered bad arguments in our forefathers' small gatherings, boosting overall problem solving to reach a common purpose. Our prejudices may be tempered by others. These mechanisms, according to Mercier and Sperber, can backfire if we live in a technological and social bubble and miss out on the regular argument and counter-argument that could fix our prejudices. As a result, we simply gather more data to support our viewpoints. Before we can learn how to avoid those mistakes, we need to look into another type of intelligence trap: the curse of expertise, which describes how learned knowledge and professional experience, rather than our mostly innate general intelligence, can backfire. You can never know too much, as we'll see in one of the FBI's most notorious blunders. Free the expert mind's beauty and fragility. The curse of knowledge. Brandon Mayfield, a lawyer, called his mother in a panic one Friday evening in April 2004. If we were to mysteriously vanish, if federal officials surreptitiously rush in and arrest us, he warned her, "I would require your guarantee that you could travel to Portland on the first flight and take the kids back to Kansas with you." Mayfield, an attorney and former U.S. Army officer, was not prone to paranoia, but America was still grieving from the aftermath of 9/11. Mayfield perceived an atmosphere of hysteria and Islamophobia as a Muslim convert married to an Egyptian wife, and a series of bizarre events led him to believe he was being investigated. When his wife Mona got home from work one day, she discovered the front door was double-locked with a top bolt, despite the fact that the family never employed the extra precaution. Mayfield arrived into his office one day to find a dusty footprint on his desk, hidden beneath a loose tile on the ceiling, despite the fact that no one should have been in the room overnight. Meanwhile, a suspicious automobile, driven by a stocky 50 or 60-year-old, seemed to be following him to and from the mosque on the road. Given the current political context, he suspected he was being watched. In an interview, he said there was this sense that it could be a hidden government agency. Mayfield claimed that by the time he made that eloquent phone call to his mother, he had began to feel the impending gloom about his fate, and he was terrified for his 3 children. 3 hard thumps on his office door about 9:45 a.m. on May 6th confirmed his worst suspicions. 2 FBI agents had arrived to apprehend Mayfield in connection with the horrific Madrid bombings of the 11th of March that year, which killed 192 people and injured almost 2,000 more. He was handcuffed behind his back and put into a car before being driven to the local courthouse. He contended that he was unaware of the attacks and that he was stunned by the senseless violence when he first heard the news. However, FBI officials claimed to have discovered his fingerprint on a detonator-filled blue shopping bag abandoned in a van in Madrid. There was no way the FBI could have been mistaken when they called it a 100% positive match. Mayfield was confined in a cell as the FBI put together a case to submit to the grand jury. As he details in his book Improbable Cause, he was tied and shackled in leg shackles and belly chains, and he was strip-searched frequently. His lawyers presented a dismal picture for him, saying he might be sent to Guantanamo Bay if the grand jury finds he was engaged in the assaults. Fingerprints are regarded the gold standard of forensic evidence. As the judge remarked in his first hearing, persons have been convicted of murder based on little more than a single print in the past. It was once thought that the chances of 2 persons having the same fingerprint were billions to 1. Mayfield pondered how his fingerprint could have shown on a plastic carrier bag 5,400 miles away, spanning the whole American continent and the Atlantic Ocean. However, there was no way. His lawyers warned that simply denying such a strong line of evidence could result in him being charged with perjury. My instant instinct was that I was being framed by nameless officials, Mayfield told me. His lawyers eventually persuaded the court to appoint Kenneth Moses as an independent examiner to re-examine the prints. Moses' credentials were flawless, much like those of the FBI's own specialists. He had been a member of the San Francisco Police Department for 27 years and had received numerous accolades and honors during that time. It was Mayfield's final opportunity, and on the 19th of May, after nearly 2 weeks in prison, he returned to the 10th floor of the courthouse to watch Moses testify by video conference. Mayfield's worst suspicions were confirmed as Moses' testimony unfolded. Moses testified in court. I compared the latent prints to the known prints that were supplied on Brandon Mayfield, and I came to the conclusion that the latent print belongs to Mr. Mayfield's left index finger. He had no idea that a stunning turn of events on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean would save him in the near future. The Spanish National Police had identified an Algerian man, Ounain Daoud, as a suspect in the bombs that morning. Not only could they establish that his thumb matched an additional print found on the bag that was originally matched to Mayfield, including some uncertain areas disregarded by the FBI, but they could also show that his finger matched the print previously attributed to Mayfield. He was unquestionably their man. Mayfield was released the next day, and the FBI would have to issue a humiliating public apology before the end of the month. What went wrong? Exactly. A mere lack of skill, of all the possible reasons, cannot be the answer. The FBI's forensics teams are widely regarded as the best in the world. Indeed, a closer examination of the FBI's errors suggests that they did not occur despite the knowledge of its examiners. They may have occurred as a result of it. The preceding chapters looked at how general intelligence, or the ability to reason abstractly as assessed by IQ or SATs, might backfire. However, the emphasis should be on the word generic, and you may hope that more specialized knowledge and professional competence, gained through years of experience, could offset those inaccuracies. Unfortunately, new study suggests that these can also drive people to make inadvertent errors. These findings should not be confused with vaguer accusations that academics, such as Paul Frampton, live in an ivory tower cut off from real world. Instead, the latest research reveals vulnerabilities in instances where most people would expect experience to safeguard you from making mistakes. You want to be in the hands of a doctor, pilot, or accountant who has a long and successful career behind them if you're having heart surgery, flying across the globe, or trying to invest in unexpected windfall. You chose Moses if you need an independent witness to confirm a fingerprint match in a high-profile case. Yet, there are now a variety of sociological, psychological, and neurological explanations for why expert judgment occasionally fails when it is most needed. And the roots of these errors are intricately linked to the processes that ordinarily allow experts to perform so effectively. Many of the cornerstones, or building blocks, that make an expert and enable them to do their job efficiently and quickly also include vulnerabilities. You can't have one without the other, says cognitive neuroscientist Anil Dror of University College London, who has been at the forefront of much of this research. In many ways, the more knowledgeable you are, the more vulnerable you are. Experts will undoubtedly be correct the most of the time, but when they are incorrect, the consequences can be terrible, and a comprehensive knowledge of the possibility for expert error is crucial if we are to avoid such failures. As we'll see, those flaws clouded the FBI examiner's judgment, resulting in a series of poor decisions that led to Mayfield's arrest. They have resulted in the untimely deaths of pilots and civilians in aviation, and they have contributed to the 2008 financial crisis in finance. Before we go into that research, there are a few key assumptions to consider. A sense of overconfidence could be one root of expert error. Perhaps specialists overestimate their abilities, believing their abilities to be infallible. The concept appears to be consistent with the descriptions of the bias-blind area that we discussed in the previous chapter. Until recently, however, the majority of scientific studies supported the opposite, incompetents have an exaggerated sense of their talents. Consider a classic study by University of Michigan's David Dunning and New York University's Justin Kruger, a sad case of MacArthur Wheeler, who attempted to rob 2 banks in Pittsburgh in 1995, appears to have inspired Dunning and Kruger. He committed the acts in broad daylight, and he was apprehended by the police only a few hours later. "But I wore the juice," Wheeler reportedly shouted, clearly bewildered. Wheeler had mistakenly imagined that a layer of lemon juice, the base of invisible ink, would render him undetectable on CCTV tape. As a result of this anecdote, Dunning and Kruger questioned if ignorance and overconfidence are typically linked, and they set out to prove it in a series of tests. They offered pupils grammatical and logical thinking examinations and asked them to rate how well they believed they did. The majority of respondents underestimated their own talents, but this was especially true of those who performed the worst. In technical words, their self-assurance was misaligned. They had no concept how horrible they were. Dunning and Kruger discovered that by providing instruction in the essential abilities, they could diminish overconfidence. Not only did the participants improve their skills, but they also gained a better understanding of their limitations as a result of their expanded knowledge. The discovery has been reproduced numerous times across many cultures since Dunning and Kruger first published their study in 1999. One study looked at the math skills of 15-year-old children in 34 countries, ranging from Australia to Germany and Brazil to South Korea. Once again, the least able were often the most overconfident. The press, predictably, has jumped on board with the Dunning-Kruger effect, proclaiming it to be the reason why losers have delusions of grandeur and why incompetents think they are fantastic, and blaming it for President Donald Trump's more narcissistic utterances. The Dunning-Kruger effect, on the other hand, should be beneficial. While it may be disconcerting when someone who is highly unskilled but confident rises to power, it does at least reassure us that education and training are effective in enhancing not only our knowledge, but also our metacognition and self-awareness. In an essay titled "The Triumph of Stupidity," Bertrand Russell stated that the main reason of the difficulty is that in the current environment, the dumb are cocksure, while the bright are full of doubt. Unfortunately, these findings do not provide a whole picture. These tests focused on general abilities and knowledge rather than the more formal and thorough study that comes with a university degree. For example, in tracing the tenuous link between perceived and actual competence. When you look at folks who have a higher degree, a more disturbing notion of the expert brain emerges. A group of mathematicians, historians, and sportsmen were entrusted in 2010 with identifying names that symbolized important figures in each discipline. They had to figure out whether Johannes de Groot or Benoit Thuron, for example, were prominent mathematicians, and they could only respond with yes, no, or don't know. As one might expect, professionals were better at identifying the correct people, such as Johannes de Groot, who was a true mathematician if they were in their field. They were, however, more likely to declare they recognized the fictitious characters. In this case, Benoit Thuron. They would rather estimate and overclaim the depth of their knowledge than admit their ignorance with a don't know when their self-perception of competence was called into question. Meanwhile, during a study released in 2016, Yale University's Matthew Fisher questioned university graduates about their college major. He wanted to test their understanding of the degree's core topics, so he asked them to assess how well they understood some of their discipline's fundamental principles. For example, a physicist might be asked to assess their understanding of thermodynamics, while a biologist might be asked to describe Krebs' cycle. Fisher next threw a surprise test on the participants, requiring them to write a detailed account of the ideas they claimed to understand. Many people struggled to produce a clear answer while declaring a high degree of knowledge. This was, however, only true within the scope of their degree. Graduates' first estimates tended to be significantly more realistic when they evaluated themes outside of their specialization or more general, daily subjects. One possible explanation is that the participants were unaware of how much they had forgotten since receiving their degree, a phenomenon Fisher refers to as meta-forgetfulness. Fisher explained, "People conflate their current degree of knowing with their highest level of knowledge, and this could indicate a fundamental flaw with our educational system. The most cynical interpretation is that we're not providing pupils with knowledge that will stick with them," Fisher said. "We're just giving them the impression that they know things when they don't, and that appears to be ineffective. You may become more closed-minded as a result of the appearance of expertise." Victor Attati of Loyola University in Chicago discovered that priming people to feel educated makes them less likely to seek out or listen to opposing viewpoints. When we evaluate the social norms around expertise, we presume that an expert already has the qualifications to stick to their beliefs, which Attati refers to as earned dogmatism. The word shoshin, which captures the fertility of the beginner's mind and its ability to embrace new ideas, was used by the Japanese to express these principles. In the 1970s, Zen monk Shunryu Suzuki said, "There are many possibilities in the beginner's mind. There are few in the expert's mind." Experts, of course, may have greater reasons to believe what they do in many circumstances. But, as Fisher's research suggests, if they overestimate their own knowledge and then firmly refuse to seek or accept another's viewpoint, they may swiftly find themselves out of their depth. This feature, according to Attati, could explain why some politicians become more adamant in their beliefs and fail to update their knowledge or seek compromise, a mentality he refers to as myopic overconfidence. Earned dogmatism could also explain why scientists with Nobel disease, such as Kary Mullies, make such odd assertions. Subramanian Chandrasekhar, an Indian-American astronomer who won the Nobel Prize, saw this in his colleagues. These people have had deep insights and discoveries. They believe that because they were so successful in one field, they must have a unique perspective on science. However, science forbids it. Nature has repeatedly demonstrated that the types of truth that underpin nature transcend even the most powerful brains. Inflated self-confidence and earned dogmatism are just the beginning of the expert's defects. And to fully comprehend the FBI's mistakes, we must go deeper into the neurology of expertise and the ways that intensive training may permanently alter our brain's perception, for good or for bad. The story begins with Adriaan de Groot, a Dutch psychologist who is frequently regarded as the father of cognitive psychology. Beginning his career during WWII, de Groot had been a brilliant talent at school and university, showing potential in music, mathematics, and psychology, but the severe political situation on the brink of the war provided few possibilities to continue his education after graduation. Instead, de Groot eked out a living as a high school teacher and, later, as an occupational psychologist for a railroad business. Chess, on the other hand, was de Groot's true love. He had represented his country in an international event in Buenos Aires, and had decided to interview other players about their techniques to see if they could reveal the secrets of remarkable performance. He started by displaying them a chessboard, and then asked them to discuss their mental methods as they planned their next move. De Groot had assumed that their abilities stemmed from their mental calculations, brute force. Perhaps they were simply better at crunching the numbers and simulating the outcomes. However, this did not appear to be the case. The experts did not claim to have cycled through many positions, and they frequently made decisions in a matter of seconds, which would not have given them enough time to examine the various methods. Following up on the players' seeming intuition, investigations revealed that it was actually an amazing feat of memory done by a technique known as chunking. Instead of understanding the game in terms of individual pieces, the skilled player divides the board into larger units, or complexes, of pieces. Those complexes can then construct templates or psychological scripts known as schemas, each of which reflects a particular scenario and technique, similar to how words can be joined into larger phrases. This turns the board into something significant, and it's thought to be why certain chess grandmasters can play numerous games at once, even while blindfolded. Instead of computing each conceivable move from beginning, specialists look through a wide mental library of schemas to locate the move that matches the board in front of them, considerably reducing the processing stress for the player's brain. De Groot highlighted that the schemas might become profoundly ingrained in the player over time, implying that the correct solution may come to mind automatically with only a glance at the board, which perfectly accounts for those remarkable bursts of brilliance we have come to identify with expert intuition. Automatic, ingrained behaviors also free up more working memory in the brain, which may explain how professionals operate in difficult situations. It would be utterly hard to explain why some chess players can still play wonderfully when under the influence of alcohol if this were not the case. De Groot subsequently wrote, De Groot's discoveries would eventually earn him a doctorate from the University of Amsterdam, allowing him to leave his tiresome occupations at the high school and railway. It has now sparked a slew of other studies in a variety of fields, explaining everything from Scrabble and poker champions to elite athletes like Serena Williams' incredible accomplishments and the lightning-fast coding of world-class computer programmers. Although the exact methods vary depending on the talent, the expert in each case benefits from a wide library of schemas that allow them to extract the most significant data, recognize the underlying patterns and dynamics, and respond with an almost automatic reaction from a pre-learned script. This notion of competence may also help us understand less well-known talents, such as London cab drivers' amazing navigation of the city's 25,000 streets. Rather than knowing the entire cityscape, they've created schemas of recognized routes, so that seeing a landmark will automatically propose the optimal route from point A to point B, based on the current traffic, without them having to recall and analyze the full map. The same neural mechanisms may be used by burglars. Researchers demonstrated that more experienced burglars have amassed a set of advanced schemas based on the familiar layouts of British homes, allowing them to automatically intuit the best route through a house and alight on the most valuable possessions by asking real convicts to participate in virtual reality simulations of their crimes. The search becomes a natural instinct, like a military operation. It becomes normal, one prison inmate told the researchers. There's no denying that in the vast majority of instances, an expert's intuition is a highly effective way of functioning, and it's often lauded as a type of nearly superhuman genius. Unfortunately, it can also come at a high cost. One is adaptability. The expert may rely too heavily on old behavioral patterns to cope with change. Experienced London taxi drivers appeared to struggle with the rapid development of Canary Wharf at the end of the 20th century. For example, when tested on their recollections, they just couldn't integrate the new landmarks and update their old mental templates of the city. Similarly, an expert gaming champion will have a tougher time learning a new set of rules, and an accountant will have a difficult time adapting to new tax laws. If an expert fails to go outside their own schemas for fresh ways to approach an issue, cognitive entrenchment might hinder creative problem solving. They grow enamored with the old methods of doing things. The second cost could be a keen sense of observation. The expert brain loses sight of the tiny parts as it chops up the raw data into more understandable components and seeks to recognize broad underlying patterns. This shift has been observed in real-time scans of professional radiologists' brains. They had more activity in the temporal lobe regions associated with advanced pattern recognition and symbolic meaning, and less activity in the visual cortex regions associated with combing over minute detail. The ability to filter out irrelevant information and reduce distractions will be an advantage, but it will also mean that the expert will be less likely to consider all of the elements of a problem in a systematic manner, potentially causing them to miss important nuances that do not easily fit their mental maps. Things are just going to get worse. Emotions and expectancies, as well as cognitive biases like framing and anchoring, are more easily swayed by expert conclusions based on just than rigorous analysis. As a result, their rationality quotient may have been diminished as a result of their training. How the expert looks at the material is influenced by their attitude, which is dependent on what they expect, hope for, and whether they are in a good or poor mood that day. It was told to me by Émile Dror, and the brain systems that give an expert their competence, the real cognitive architecture, are extremely vulnerable to that. Of course, the expert could ignore their instincts and return to a more extensive, systematic analysis. However, individuals are frequently fully oblivious of the danger. They suffer from the bias blind spot described in Chapter 2. Since a result, their accuracy reaches a plateau, as these errors become more common among specialists than those caused by ignorance or inexperience. When that imperfect, gist-based processing is paired with overconfidence and earned dogmatism, we have one final manifestation of the intelligence trap, with potentially fatal implications. The FBI's response to the Madrid bombings is an excellent example of these procedures in operation. Matching fingerprints is a difficult task, with analyses based on 3 levels of increasingly complex features, ranging from broad patterns like whether your prints have a left or right-facing swirl, a whorl, or an arch, to finer details like whether a particular line splits in 2, breaks into fragments, forms a eye, or ends abruptly. Examiners should strive to find roughly 10 distinguishing characteristics in total. Expert examiners typically go through this procedure semi-automatically, chunking the picture in the same way as de Groot's chess grandmasters do to pick the features that are deemed the most helpful for comparison, according to eye-tracking research. As a result, the points of identification may easily pop out at an expert analyst, whereas a novice would have to go through the process of systematically identifying and checking each one exactly the type of top-down decision-making that can be influenced by bias. Dror has discovered that expert examiners are susceptible to a variety of cognitive errors that can result from such automatic processing. If they were told that a suspect had previously confessed to the crime, they were more likely to find a positive match. When they were shown emotionally charged content, such as a graphic depiction of a murder victim, the same thing happened. Despite the fact that it should not have influenced their objective judgment, the examiners were more likely to match the fingerprints this time, maybe because they were more driven and determined to apprehend the criminal. Dror points out that this is especially problematic when the available data is vague and muddy, which was the case with the Madrid evidence. The fingerprint was smudged and difficult to discern because it was left on a crumpled carrier bag. Mayfield's name appeared as the 4th of 20 possible suspects when the FBI ran the fingerprint through a computer analysis to locate prospective suspects among their millions of registered prints. The FBI analysts had no idea about his background at this point, as his fingerprints were only on file from a juvenile run-in with the law. However, it appears that they were desperate for a match, and after they decided on Mayfield, they grew further committed in their decision, despite clear signals that they had chosen the incorrect choice. The examiners had found about 15 areas of resemblance in the fingerprints, but they had routinely missed substantial differences. The failure of a part of the latent print, the upper left-hand area, to match Mayfield's index finger was the most remarkable. The examiners reasoned that this area may have come from someone else's finger, which had touched the bag at a different time, or it could have originated from Mayfield himself, who had left a second print superimposed on the first, creating a confused pattern. In any case, they chose to ignore that strange segment and concentrate on the part that looked most like Mayfield's. However, if the abnormal part came from another finger, you'd expect to find telltale indications, because the two fingers would have been at different angles. The ridges would have overlapping and crisscrossed. You might also expect the two fingers to have applied different amounts of pressure on the bag, changing the appearance of the impressions left behind. One section might have appeared fainter than the other. In this example, neither indication was present. The two people would have had to grab the bag with the same force, and their prints would have had to miraculously align for the FBI's claim to make sense. It had a very slim likelihood of happening. The print was from a single finger, which was not Mayfield's, according to the most likely explanation. These were not minor nuances, but rather blatant flaws in the argument. The Office of Inspector General, OIG, later found that the entire disregard for this possibility was completely unnecessary. The OIG said the explanation required the examiners to accept an exceptional collection of coincidences. Because of these inconsistencies, some independent fingerprint examiners who looked over the case thought that Mayfield should have been ruled out right away. This wasn't the only instance of circular reasoning in the FBI's case. The OIG discovered that the examiners were far more likely to dismiss or ignore any points of interest that contradicted their initial hunch, while paying far less attention to details that appeared to suggest a match. Across the board, the two marked up prints above, taken from the publicly available OIG report, demonstrate just how many mistakes they made. Mayfield's print is on the right, whereas Madrid's is on the left. Although the flaws are difficult to spot for a total newbie, if you look closely enough, you can spot several distinguishing traits that are present in one, but not the other. The foreign language effect has since been replicated in a number of other countries, including Israel and Spain, as well as with a variety of other cognitive biases, such as the hot hand illusion, which is the belief that success in one random event increases our chances of having similar luck in the future. People were more reasonable in each situation when asked to reason in their second language rather than their first. Our reasoning may feel stiffish, as Nabokov put it, but the emotional distance allows us to think more deeply about the issue at hand. Aside from this immediate benefit, learning another language can help you differentiate between emotions by teaching you new untranslatable phrases that allow you to see more nuance in your sentiments. It can also exercise your actively open-minded thinking by forcing you to see the world through a new cultural lens, while the challenge of grappling with unfamiliar phrases increases your tolerance of ambiguity. A related psychological measure that means you are better equipped to cope with feelings of uncertainty rather than jumping to a conclusion too quickly. That's regarded to be important for creativity as well as minimizing bias. Ambiguity tolerance, for example, is associated to entrepreneurial innovation. Given the time and effort required, no one would recommend learning a language solely to improve your reasoning. But if you already speak one or have been tempted to resurrect a language you left behind in school, the foreign language effect could be an additional strategy to help you manage your emotions and make better decisions. At the very least, think about how it affects your professional interactions with overseas colleagues. The language you use could influence whether they are convinced by the statement's emotions or the facts. If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head, Nelson Mandela famously stated. If you speak to him in his native tongue, you will touch his heart. One of the most intriguing consequences of the research on emotional awareness and reflective thinking is that it may finally provide a solution to the curse of expertise. As we observed in Chapter 3, more experience might lead specialists to rely on hazy, gist-based intuitions, which can provide quick and efficient decision-making but also lead to mistakes. The implication might have seemed to be that we'd have to give up some of our efficiency, but new research shows that there are methods to use those flashes of insight while lowering the number of unnecessary errors. Medicine has been at the forefront of these investigations, and with good cause. Approximately 10% to 15% of initial diagnoses are wrong, implying that many clinicians will make at least one error out of every 6 patients they treat. Often, these errors may be addressed before harm is done, but it is estimated that 1 out of every 10 patient deaths in U.S. hospitals, between 40,000 and 80,000 each year, is due to a diagnostic error. Is it possible that a simple shift in thinking could help save some of those lives? I met Sylvia Mainde amid the throngs of Rotterdam's Erasmus Medical Center to find out. They had moved to the Netherlands from Ceará, Brazil, over a decade ago, and she greets me with a strong cup of coffee, not the watery thing you get here, she says, before taking a seat across from me with a notebook in hand. Having a pencil and paper helps you organize your thoughts, she stated. Psychological studies show that allowing you to draw while you talk improves your memory. Her goal is to train doctors to think about how they make decisions in the same manner she does. The notion is apparently simple: to pause, ponder, and examine your assumptions. Much like the medical checklist that Dr. and writer Adel Gawand has demonstrated to be so effective in preventing memory errors during surgery. Early attempts to engage System 2 thinking, on the other hand, had been disappointing. Doctors who were told to use pure analysis instead of intuition, for example, by immediately listing all the alternative hypotheses, often performed worse than those who took a less deliberative, more intuitive approach. This makes reasonable in view of the semantic marker idea. If you ask someone to reflect too soon, they may not be able to draw on their experience and become overly fixated on insignificant details. You're preventing them from using their emotional compass, and they're starting to resemble Damasio's brain injury patients, who are locked in analytical paralysis. You can't just use one or the other. You have to employ both. As a result, Mainde advises doctors to write down their gut reaction as soon as possible, and then analyze the evidence for their gut reaction and compare it to alternative ideas. Indeed, she has since discovered that by using this simple strategy, clinicians can improve their diagnostic accuracy by up to 40%. A big accomplishment for such a minor change, without any additional instructions on re-examining the data or producing new ideas. Simply telling doctors to revisit their initial hypothesis improved accuracy by 10%, which is a big improvement for no more effort. This introspective reasoning also minimizes the effective biases that might alter a doctor's intuition, which is in line with other research on emotion. All of these things, the patient's appearance, whether they are wealthy or poor, the time pressure, whether they interrupt you, all of these things can cause System 1 to malfunction, she explained. However, it is hoped that reflective reasoning will cause the physician to pause. And recently investigated how doctors respond to difficult patients, such as those who rudely criticize the expert's conclusions, to investigate one such aspect, rather than monitoring genuine meetings, which would be difficult to assess objectively. Mainde presented a group of general practitioners with fictional stories, family doctors. The material primarily described their symptoms and test findings, but it also included a few phrases that described their behavior. Many of the doctors claimed that they were unaware of the contextual information, while others were surprised as to why they had been given these additional details. That this isn't important, they exclaimed. We've been taught to look past it, to ignore the behavior. It shouldn't make a difference, Mainde said. In reality, as evidenced by emotion research, it had a significant impact. General practitioners were 42% more likely to make a diagnosis error for challenging patients in more complex instances. The doctors, on the other hand, were more likely to see past their frustration and give the proper diagnosis if they were told to engage in the more contemplative method. The pause in their thinking appears to have allowed them to assess their own feelings and adjust for their frustration, as predicted by theories of emotion distinction and regulation. Mainde has also looked into the availability bias, which leads clinicians to overdiagnose an ailment if it has recently been in the news and is on their minds. She has once again demonstrated that the more introspective technique reduces the problem, despite the fact that she gave no special instructions or explanations warning them of the bias. When you look at the graphs from these research, it's incredible. The doctors who were not exposed to the disease reports had a 71% accuracy rate, while the prejudiced doctors only had a 50% accuracy rate. And then, after some thought, they went back to 70%. She explained, "It entirely compensated for the prejudice," says the researcher. "These are incredible results for such minor treatments, but they all demonstrate the potential of increased self-awareness when we allow ourselves to think more critically about our instincts." Some doctors may be put off by Maine's proposals. The idea that, after all their training, something so basic may remedy their errors is a slap in the face to the ego, especially for those who take great confidence in their quick intuition. She will, for example, present a case on the projector at a conference and wait for the doctors to make a diagnosis. It can take up to 20 seconds. They merely read 4 or 5 lines and say appendicitis. She explained, "There's even a joke that says if a doctor needs to think, he should leave the room." However, there is also a rising movement in medicine to incorporate the most recent psychological findings into daily practice. Pat Croskery of Dalhousie University in Canada is leading a critical thinking program for doctors, and much of his advice echoes the research we've looked at in this chapter, such as using mindfulness to identify the emotional sources of our decisions, and using a cognitive and effective autopsy to figure out why their intuition failed. He also promotes cognitive inoculation, which involves studying case studies to identify potential sources of bias, implying that doctors will be more aware of the things that influence their thinking. Croskery is still gathering data from his courses to examine how they affect diagnostic accuracy over time. However, even if these strategies can only avert a small percentage of the 40,000, 80,000 deaths per year, they will have made a greater contribution than a significant new medicine. Despite the fact that medicine is leading the way, a few other professions are following suit. In response to this research, the American Judges Association has issued a white paper advocating mindfulness as one of the key strategies for improving judicial decision-making, as well as advising each judge to take a moment to read the dials and interrogate their feelings in detail, just as neuroscientists and psychologists like Feldman Barrett suggest. In the end, these findings may alter our perceptions of what it means to be an expert. In the past, psychologists regarded the learning curve as having 4 separate levels. The total beginner is unknowingly inept. She has no idea what she doesn't know, possibly leading to the overconfidence we saw in Chapter 3 due to the Dunning-Kruger effect. She will, however, recognize the talents she lacks and what she needs to get them after a short time. She is deliberately inadequate. She can become consciously competent with enough work. She can solve most problems, but she has to think a lot about the decisions she makes. After years of training and on-the-job experience, those decisions have finally become second nature to her. She has achieved unconscious competence. This was once considered the peak of expertise, but as we've seen, due to the expert biases we discussed in Chapter 3, she may reach a limit where her accuracy plateaus. To break through that barrier, we may require one more stage: reflective competence, which characterizes the ability to analyze our feelings and intuitions, as well as the ability to spot biases before they do harm. Intuition may be a powerful thing, as Ray Kroc discovered in that Californian cafe, but only if we know how to understand those funny bone feelings. 6. How to recognize lies and misinformation with a bullshit detection kit. If you were online during the turn of the century, you may recall hearing about the flesh-eating bananas legend. In late 1999, a chain email became viral on the internet, claiming that fruit imported from Central America may cause necrotizing fasciitis, a rare condition in which the skin erupts into lurid purple boils before dissolving and peeling away from muscle and bone. This disease has recently destroyed the monkey population in Costa Rica. According to the email, if you have eaten a banana in the recent 2-3 days and have had a fever and a skin infection, get medical attention immediately. Necrotizing fasciitis is a painful skin condition that consumes 2 to 3 centimeters of flesh every hour. Amputation is a distinct possibility, as is death. If you are more than an hour away from a medical facility, it is recommended that you burn the flesh ahead of the diseased spot to prevent the spread of the virus. Fearing a widespread panic, the FDA has been hesitant to issue a nationwide warning. They have discreetly admitted that they believe this will affect up to 15,000 Americans, but that these are acceptable numbers. Please forward this to as many people as possible, as we do not believe 15,000 individuals is a sufficient number. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States issued a statement on January 28, 2000, rejecting the concerns. Their reaction, however, merely added gasoline to the fire, as people forgot about the correction and remembered the terrifying, vivid image of flesh-eating bananas. The CDC was also cited in several of the chain emails as the source of the rumors, giving them further legitimacy. The CDC was obliged to set up a banana hotline after receiving so many panicked calls within weeks, and it wasn't until the end of the year that the panic died out as the anticipated epidemic failed to materialize. Although the necrotizing fasciitis emails were one of the first internet memes, misinformation is nothing new. Falsehood flies, and the truth limps behind it. Observe Jonathan Swift in an article about the fast spread of political lies in the 17th century. Today, so-called fake news is more common than it has ever been. According to a 2016 poll, experts refuted more than half of the most popular medical posts on Facebook, including claims that dandelion weed may improve your immune system and cure cancer, and claims that the HPV vaccine raised your chance of cancer. The phenomena is not limited to the West, albeit the medium used may differ depending on the country. In India, for example, false reports spread like wildfire over the country's 300 million smartphones, ranging from local salt shortages to political propaganda and fake mass kidnapping charges. His rumors even sparked a wave of lynchings in 2018. You'd think that traditional schooling would shield us from these deceptions. If our schools turn out their pupils in that attitude of mind which is conducive to good judgment in any department of affairs in which the pupils are placed, they have done more than if they sent out their pupils merely possessed of vast stores of information or high degrees of skill in specialized branches, wrote the great American philosopher John Dewey in the early 20th century. Unfortunately, research on disrationalia indicates that this is not the case. All university graduates are less likely than the general public to believe in political conspiracies. They are slightly more susceptible to medical misinformation, believing, for example, that pharmaceutical companies withhold cancer drugs for profit, or that doctors conceal the fact that vaccines cause illnesses. They're also more prone to try unproven alternative therapies. Arlette Mendocino, who worked at the University of Ottawa's medical department, was one of the first people to bring the flesh-eating banana panic to Canada. Someone who should have been a little more skeptical. I was thinking about my family and my friends. After she realized she'd been duped, she told CBC News, "I had good intentions." The message had gone across the country in a matter of days. The Office of the Inspector General found that this was a clear case of confirmation bias. But given what we know about top-down processing and the selective attention that comes with expertise, it's plausible that the examiners weren't even perceiving those things in the first place. Their expectations had almost completely blinded them. With a really independent analysis, these flaws may have been exposed. Despite the fact that the prints were examined by many examiners, each one was aware of their colleagues' conclusions, impacting their decision. Dror refers to this as a bias cascade. Officers conducting covert surveillance of Mayfield, and his family mistaken his daughter's Spanish schoolwork for travel paperwork, putting him in Madrid at the time of the attack. When the FBI investigated into Mayfield's background, they learned that he was a practicing Muslim and that he had previously represented one of the Portland 7 terrorists in a child custody matter. It had no influence on his presumed guilt. In actuality, the FBI was so sure of itself that they overlooked more evidence from Spain's national police, the SNP. The SNP had tried and failed to verify the match by mid-April, but the FBI lab promptly dismissed their worries. Pedro Luis Melodelido, head of the SNP's fingerprint unit, told the New York Times shortly after Mayfield was exonerated they had a rationale for everything. However, I couldn't see it. Internal FBI emails show that the examiners were unconcerned with the debate. I spoke with the lab this morning, and they are 100% certain that they have the print match, without a doubt. According to one FBI agent, they'll testify in any court you swear them into. Says the narrator, Mayfield may have ended up in Guantanamo Bay, or on death row, if the SNP had not been able to establish their own proof that he was innocent. They stormed a house in a Madrid suburb a few weeks after the first bombs. Instead of surrendering to capture, the suspects detonated a suicide device, but authorities discovered documents carrying the name of Al-Nain Daoud, an Algerian national whose prints had been on record for an immigration event. Mayfield was released after a week and was fully cleared of any involvement in the attack. He eventually received $2 million in compensation after contesting the legality of his arrest. This is a social as well as a psychological lesson. Mayfield's story vividly exemplifies how experts' overconfidence, paired with our naive reliance in their abilities, can amplify their prejudices with potentially disastrous consequences. Given the absence of evidence that Mayfield had even left the country, the chain of failures throughout the FBI and the courts should not have been allowed to escalate so quickly. With this understanding, we can begin to see why some existing safety precautions, despite being frequently effective, fail to protect us from expert error. Take, for example, aviation. Airports and pilots, which are often regarded as one of the most trustworthy enterprises on the planet, already have multiple safety nets in place to capture any temporary slips in judgment. The use of checklists as reminders of key operations, which is now popular in many other industries, began in the cockpit to ensure safer takeoffs and landings. For example, these solutions, however, fail to account for the blind spots that result from knowledge. With practice, the safety measures become second nature to the pilot's automatic scripts, and they fade from conscious awareness. According to one study of 19 major accidents, the outcome is an insidious shift toward less conservative judgment, which has resulted in people dying when the pilot's knowledge should have safeguarded them from error. This was obvious about 6 a.m. on August 25, 2007 at Bluegrass Airport in Lexington, Kentucky. Around 6 a.m., Comair Flight 5191 was scheduled to take off from runway 22, but the pilot chose a shorter runway. Both the captain and co-pilot ignored all the warning indicators that they were in the incorrect area due to their prejudices resulting from their previous expertise, before ricocheting off an embankment, smashing into a pair of trees, and erupting into flames. The plane broke through the perimeter barrier. As a result, 47 passengers, including the captain, died. The problem with aviation competence doesn't end there. Experimental investigations have demonstrated that a pilot's skill can alter their visual perception, causing them to underestimate the depth of cloud in a storm. For example, based on their prior assumptions, as we witnessed with the FBI's forensic scientists. The intelligence trap demonstrates that being foolproof isn't enough. Procedures must also be expert-proof. The nuclear power industry is one of the few industries that accounts for the automatization that comes with expertise, with some plants routinely rearranging the order of processes in their safety checks to avoid inspectors working on autopilot. The same lesson might be applied to a variety of different industries, including aviation. A better understanding of the curse of expertise and the benefits of ignorance can also help explain why some businesses thrive in the face of change, while others implode. Consider the findings of a recent research by Georgetown University's Rohan Williamson, who looked at the fortunes of banks throughout financial crises. He was particularly interested in the duties of independent directors, or those hired from outside the company to provide advice to management. The independent director is supposed to provide a type of self-regulation that should necessitate a particular level of knowledge, and many come from other financial organizations. However, because it is difficult to find a competent specialist with no other competing interests, some of the independent directors may be selected from other fields of business, implying that they may lack the more technical knowledge of the procedures involved in the bank's complex transactions. Previously, organizations such as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, claimed that a lack of financial competence contributed to the 2008 financial crisis. But what if they'd gotten it backwards and ignorance was truly a virtue? Williamson looked at data from 100 institutions before and after the financial crisis to find out. Until 2006, the results were exactly what you'd expect if you assume that having more knowledge always helps you make better decisions. Banks with an expert board did slightly better than those with fewer, or no independent directors with a finance background, because they were more likely to endorse risky strategies that paid off. However, after the financial crisis, their fortunes changed dramatically. Suddenly, the banks with the least competence performed better. The expert board members didn't pull back and adapt their strategy because they were so entrenched and biased in their already risky decision-making, whereas the less knowledgeable independent directors were less entrenched and biased, allowing them to reduce the bank's losses as they guided them through the crash. Although the evidence comes from finance, a field that isn't often known for its logic, the lessons might be applied to any industry. When things go bad, your team's less experienced members may be the most able to help you get out of it. At least in forensic science, there has been some attempt to lessen the FBI's investigations into Brandon Mayfield's expert blunders. Jennifer M. Nookin, a UCLA law professor, notes that before Brandon Mayfield, the fingerprint community really wanted to explain any errors in the language of ineptitude. Brandon Mayfield provided a forum for discussing the notion that even the best analysts could make a mistake if their methodologies are applied correctly. Edil Dror has been at the forefront of the work describing these potential forensic judgment errors and offering feasible mitigation methods. For example, he recommends for more advanced training that includes a cognitively informed discussion of bias so that every forensic scientist is aware of the ways in which their judgment might be misled and practical techniques to mitigate these impacts. As an alcoholic at an AA meeting, admitting the problem is the first step toward recovery. He explained, another criterion is that forensic analysts make their decisions blind. That is, without any knowledge other than the direct evidence in front of them, in order to avoid being swayed by expectations and to see the evidence as objectively as possible. This is especially important when seeking a second opinion. The second examiner should be completely unaware of the previous decision. To avoid the circular reasoning that plagued the examiner's judgment following the Madrid bombings, the evidence must be presented in the appropriate way and in the right sequence, utilizing a process called linear sequential unmasking by Edil Dror. For example, before seeing the suspect's fingerprint, the examiners should mark up the latent print left on the scene, giving them preset points of comparison. They should also not be given any information about the case's context before performing a forensic assessment of the evidence. The FBI, as well as other agencies, and police departments in the United States and other nations, now use this technology. Dror's message was initially unwelcomed by the experts he studied. During our conversation at London's Wellcome Collection, he showed me an angry letter from the chair of the Fingerprint Society, which demonstrated how incensed many examiners were at the mere suggestion that they might be influenced by their expectations and emotions, which was published in a forensics journal. Any fingerprint examiner who makes an identification judgment and is persuaded in either direction by anecdotes and grisly photos is either absolutely incapable of executing the noble responsibilities expected of him, or is so immature that she should seek employment at Disneyland. He added, Dror, on the other hand, has recently discovered that a growing number of forces are heeding his advice. Things are changing, but at a glacial pace. If you talk to some examiners, they will still claim, oh no, we're objective. They feel as undecided as to whether these were true unintentional errors or the result of a plan set up. But he favors any research that serves to expose the limitations of fingerprint analysis. Each piece of evidence in court is like a brick in a wall. He explained, the issue is that they treat fingerprint analysis as if it were the entire wall, when it isn't even a strong brick, let alone a wall. Mayfield continues to practice as a lawyer. He's also a campaigner, and he and his daughter Sharia co-wrote Improbable Cause, a book about their ordeal to raise awareness of the deterioration of U.S. civil liberties in the face of increased government surveillance. He appeared to be incredibly stoic about his suffering during our talk, and not at Guantanamo in some Kafkaesque circumstance. I'm talking to you, so the legal system must have worked in that sense, he explained. However, there may be many more people who are not in such fortunate circumstances. We may now begin part 2 with this information in mind. We've seen 4 potential versions of the intelligence trap through the accounts of the termites, Arthur Conan Doyle, and the FBI's forensic examiners. We may be lacking in the tacit knowledge and counterfactual reasoning required to carry out a strategy and anticipate the implications of your actions. Disrationalia, motivated reasoning, and the biased blind spot are all conditions that allow us to rationalize and prolong our errors without seeing the defects in our own reasoning. As a result, we construct logic-tight compartments around our views without taking into account all of the data. To earn dogmatism, we may place too much faith in our own judgment, causing us to lose sight of our limitations and overestimate our talents. Finally, our knowledge allows us to engage in ingrained, routine behaviors that make us blind to evident warning signs of impending calamity and more vulnerable to bias. If we think of the brain as a car, this research backs up the idea that intelligence is the engine and education and expertise are the fuel. They put our thinking in motion by providing us with basic abstract reasoning skills and specialist knowledge. But simply adding more power won't always help you drive that vehicle safely. You may find yourself in a dead end if you lack counterfactual thinking and tacit knowledge. If you suffer from motivated reasoning, earned dogmatism, and entrenchment, you risk driving in circles, or worse, down a cliff. We've clearly identified the issue, but we still need some lessons to help us traverse these potential hazards with greater caution. The goal of a new scientific profession called evidence-based wisdom, which we'll look at in Part 2, is to correct these deficiencies. Part 2, getting out of the intelligence trap. A decision-making and reasoning toolkit for moral algebra towards an evidence-based wisdom science. At the summer of 1787, we're in Pennsylvania's stuffy state house. The heat is oppressive, yet the windows and doors have been locked to keep prying eyes out. And the sweaty delegates, many of whom are clad in thick woolen suits, are fighting vehemently. Their goal is to draft a new U.S. Constitution and the stakes are enormous. Only 11 years after the American colonies declared independence from the United Kingdom, the country's government is impoverished and largely powerless, with severe interstate rivalry. It is obvious that a new power structure is required to bring the country together. The most difficult question is how the public will be represented in Congress. Will the representatives be elected by the people or by local governments? Should more seats be allocated to larger states? Should each state, regardless of its size, be given equal representation? Smaller states, such as Delaware, are concerned that larger states, such as Virginia, would dominate them. The closed state house proved to be the perfect pressure cooker with tempers as high as the blazing temperature, and the convention looks destined to self-combust by the end of the summer. Benjamin Franklin, Philadelphia's own delegate, is tasked with calming the situation. Franklin, at the age of 81, is the convention's oldest man, and the once robust and hardy man is now so feeble that he is occasionally carried into the proceedings on a sedan chair. He concerns that their success will determine America's standing in the eyes of the world, having personally signed the Declaration of Independence. He had earlier written to Thomas Jefferson, who was away at the time, saying, "If it does not do good, it will do evil, since it will indicate that we do not have the knowledge enough among us to govern ourselves." After the day's arguing is finished, Franklin invites the delegates to dine and drink in his garden, just a few hundred feet from the convention, where he can encourage calmer discussion beneath the cooling shade of his mulberry tree. He occasionally displays his scientific collection, which includes a valued two-headed snake that he uses to symbolize hesitation and dispute. Franklin is frequently deafeningly quiet in the State House, but he dominates debates with pre-written statements. When he does intercede, though, he begs for a compromise. When making a broad table, when the edges of boards do not meet, the artist takes a little from both and builds a good joint, he argues in a heated dispute in June. This pragmatic carpentry eventually yields a solution to the dilemma of state representation, which threatened to derail the convention. The proposal arose from two Connecticut delegates, Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth, who advocated that Congress be divided into two houses, each with its own voting mechanism. Representatives in the lower house would be allocated based on population size, pleasing the larger states, whereas the Senate would have an equal number of delegates every state, regardless of population size, pleasing the smaller states. The delegates initially reject the Great Compromise, but Franklin becomes its champion. He refines the proposal, arguing that taxation and spending should be handled by the House, while state sovereignty and executive orders should be handled by the Senate. And it is finally passed in a round of voting. The delegates will have till September 17th to determine whether or not to sign the final draft. Even now, victory isn't guaranteed until Franklin delivers a stirring address at the conclusion of the proceedings. I admit that there are numerous sections of this Constitution that I do not currently approve, but I am not certain that I will never approve them, he declares. Having lived a long time, I have had numerous occasions of being forced to revise my beliefs even on important matters, which I formerly felt were correct, but were later discovered to be incorrect, either to greater information or more thorough consideration. As a result, as I get older, I'm more likely to distrust my own judgment and place more trust in the judgment of others. It's only natural, he adds, for a group of such brilliant and diverse individuals to arrive with their own prejudices and passions, but he closes by asking them to explore the possibility that their conclusions are incorrect. I cannot help but desire that every member of the convention who may still have reservations about it would, on this occasion, doubt a little of his own infallibility and sign this instrument to demonstrate our unanimity. The delegates heed his advice, and the bulk of them sign the document one by one. Franklin, relieved, turns to George Washington's chair, which has an engraved sun on the horizon. He's been debating the direction of its progress for a long time. But now, at long last, I have the joy of knowing that the sun is rising rather than setting. Franklin's calm, methodical reasoning contrasts sharply with the skewed, myopic thinking that typically comes with high intelligence and expertise. He was sensitive to anything smacking of dogma. According to his biographer Walter Isaacson, he had an empirical temperament that was generally opposed to sweeping passions, as well as practical good judgment, keen social skills, and astute emotional regulation. He wasn't always right about everything, although he subsequently became the head of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. His early opinions on slavery are unjustifiable, but in general, and especially later in life, he was able to handle really difficult situations with remarkable judgment. During the War of Independence, he used a similar approach to negotiate an alliance with France and a peace treaty with Britain, earning him the title of the most important and successful American diplomat of all time, according to one academic, and it permitted him to lead the delegates to a solution to an impossibly complex and seemingly intractable political conflict at the signing of the Constitution. Fortunately, in the new field of evidence-based wisdom, psychologists are now beginning to investigate this type of attitude. This research, in stark contrast to our previously limited understanding of human reasoning, provides a coherent framework that explains many of the problems we've encountered thus far, as well as practical ways for cultivating wiser thinking and escaping the intelligence trap. As we'll see, the same ideas can help us think more clearly about everything from our most personal decisions to major world events. In fact, the same tactics may be behind the world super forecaster's amazing forecasts that start with some definitions, instead of esoteric or spiritual definitions of wisdom. This scientific study focused on secular definitions derived from philosophy, such as Aristotle's view of practical wisdom, the set of skills, dispositions, and policies that help us understand and deliberate about what is good in life, and helps us choose the best means for pursuing those things over the course of our lives, according to philosopher Valery Tiberius. It's worth noting that this is nearly identical to Franklin's definition. Those abilities and qualities will almost certainly contain components of the tacit knowledge we discussed in Chapter 1, as well as other social and emotional skills, and the recent study on rationality. Now, if you want to be intelligent, you need to understand that we all have biases like that, and you need to understand what rules you can put in place to overcome those prejudices, Tiberius explained. Even so, scientists have only recently dedicated themselves to the study of wisdom as a separate phenomenon. The initial steps toward a more empirical framework were taken in the 1970s, with ethnographic studies evaluating how people perceive wisdom in their daily lives, and surveys examining how parts of wisdom-related thinking, such as our ability to balance many interests, develop over time. Wise reasoning did, indeed, seem to improve with age. Robert Sternberg, who had also developed the scientific definitions of practical and creative intelligence that we discussed in Chapter 1, was a vocal supporter of this early work and helped to establish its credibility. In fact, the work inspired some of the questions on his university admissions tests. Following the financial crisis of 2008, there was a surge in interest in a scientifically defined measure of wisdom. There was a kind of social disapproval for cleverness at the expense of society. Howard Nussbaum, a neuroscientist at the University of Chicago, explains, prompting an increasing number of people to consider how our concepts of reasoning could be extended beyond traditional definitions of intelligence. As a result of this surge in interest, new institutions have sprung up to address the issue head-on, such as Chicago's Center for Practical Wisdom, which launched in 2016 and is led by Nussbaum, with a slew of recent promising results. The study of wisdom appears to have reached a kind of tipping point. Igor Grossman, a psychologist from Ukraine who works at the University of Waterloo in Canada, has been in the forefront of this new movement. His goal, he claims, is to provide the same level of experimental examination, including randomized controlled trials, that other fields of study, such as medicine, have grown to anticipate. You'll need that baseline work before you can go out and convince others that if you do this, it will cure all your issues, he told me in an interview at his Toronto residence. As a result, he refers to the discipline as evidence-based wisdom, similar to how we currently refer to evidence-based medicine. Grossman's initial aim was to develop a test of wise reasoning and show that it has real-world implications that are unaffected by general intelligence, education, or professional competence. He started by looking at several philosophical definitions of wisdom, which he then split down into 6 distinct thinking principles. I think you might call them metacognitive components, he said, referring to many kinds of knowledge and cognitive processes that can lead to a more richly complicated understanding of a situation. As you might expect, this included some of the reasoning elements we've already looked at, such as the ability to consider the perspectives of the people involved in the conflict, which takes into account your ability to seek and absorb information that contradicts your initial viewpoint, and recognizing the ways in which the conflict might unfold, which involves the counterfactual thinking that Sternberg had studied in his measures of creative intelligence. However, his test included other reasoning skills we haven't looked at yet, such as the capacity to recognize the possibility of change, search for a compromise, and predict conflict resolution. Last but not least, Grossman regarded intellectual humility, a recognition of our knowledge's limitations and the inherent ambiguity in our judgments. In other words, seeing inside your bias-blind zone. It was the idea that guided Socrates over 2 millennia ago, and it was also at the heart of Franklin's address at the U.S. Constitution's signing. Grossman next asked his participants to think aloud about a variety of difficulties, ranging from media articles about international conflicts to a syndicated Dear Abby agony aunt column about a family feud, while a group of colleagues graded them on the various attributes. Consider the following scenario to get a sense of the test. Greetings, Abby. My husband, Ralph, has a sister named Dawn and a brother named Kurt. 6 years ago, their parents died within months of each other. Dawn has mentioned getting a headstone for their parents once a year since then. I'm all for it, but Dawn is set on spending a lot of money on it, and she expects her brothers to chip in. She recently informed me that she had set aside $2,000 to pay for it. Dawn recently contacted to say that she had chosen the design, written the epitaph, and placed the order for the headstone. She now expects Kurt and Ralph to reimburse her for their share. She claimed she ordered it on her own since she had been feeling bad for years about her parents' lack of one. Dawn should not have to pay anything because she did it all by herself, in my opinion. I'm sure Kurt and Ralph will never hear the end of it if they don't pay her back, and neither will I. A person with a low humility score would respond, I suppose the boys will definitely wind up putting their share in. Otherwise, she'll never hear the end of it. I'm sure they're upset about it, but I'm confident that in the end they'll give in and help pay for it. The following comment received a higher grade for humility because it admits some vital but lacking information. Dawn appears to be impatient to get something done, while the others have been dragging their feet for the past 6 years, or at least nothing has been accomplished in that time. It doesn't mention how much she ultimately decided the price would be. I'm not sure that's how it happened, but it sounds like a logical course of action for them to take. It all depends on the personality of the individuals involved, which I am unfamiliar with. Similarly, a less complex answer to perspective taking would look at only one point of view. I'm sure it was a strained relationship after that, because let's just say Kurt and Ralph decided not to pay for the headstone, and there will be a communication gap between her sister and her brothers. Instead, A wiser answer is to delve deeper into the variety of possible motives. Someone may believe that we must honor our parents in this way. Someone else could believe there is nothing that needs to be done. Another person may be unable to act due to a lack of financial resources. It could also imply that the brothers are unconcerned about it. It is common for people to have opposing viewpoints on issues that are important to them. The high scorer could also see more options for how the conflict could be resolved. I think there would be some kind of compromise reached. That Kurt and Ralph recognized the importance of having some kind of headstone, and that even though Dawn went ahead and ordered it without them confirming that they'd pitch in, they'd probably pitch in some way, even if it wasn't exactly what she wanted. However, it is hoped that there was some sort of contribution. As you can see, the responses are relatively conversational. They don't require sophisticated philosophical understanding, for example, but the wiser participants are just more ready to think their way around the subtleties of the situation. Grossman compared the participants' thinking scores to several measures of well-being after the researchers had graded their thinking. The first findings, published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology in 2013, indicated that persons who scored higher on smart thinking were happier in practically every element of life. They were more happy, less likely to suffer from depression, and had stronger intimate connections. Surprisingly, they were also marginally less likely to die throughout a 5-year period, possibly because their wiser reasoning allowed them to better estimate the health hazards of various activities, or because they were better able to manage with stress. However, Grossman emphasizes that further research is needed to reproduce this particular discovery. Importantly, the participants' IQ had minimal bearing on any of these health and pleasure metrics, and was essentially unrelated to their smart reasoning scores. Although the phrase "I am wise because I know that I know nothing" has become cliched, it is nonetheless noteworthy that attributes like intellectual humility and the ability to grasp other people's perspectives can predict your happiness better than your actual intelligence. This finding adds to a growing body of knowledge about intellect, rational decision-making, and life outcomes. Wanda Bruin de Bruin, for example, obtained very comparable results, demonstrating that her measure of decision-making competence was far more effective than IQ in predicting stressors like bankruptcy and divorce. We keep finding that intelligence is a tiny bit connected to sensible reasoning. It explains maybe 5% of the variance, possibly less, and definitely not more, Grossman added. Grossman's findings also line up with Keith Stanovich's research on rationality. One of Stanovich's subtests, for example, measured a trait called actively open-minded thinking, which is similar to the concept of intellectual humility and also includes the ability to think about different points of view as well. How much would you agree with the statement that beliefs should always be changed when new information or evidence comes to light? For example, or I like to look at a lot of different types of evidence before I decide what to do. He found that people's answers to these questions were often a better predictor of their overall rationality than their general intelligence. This is good news, since unbiased decision-making should be a big part of wisdom, which is how people learn. Grossman agrees that some of these tasks will require a small amount of intelligence to do well. Someone who has a lot of problems learning will not be able to use these wisdom principles. But after a certain point, the other traits, like intellectual humility and open-mindedness, become more important for the decisions that really matter in life. His theories have been widely praised by other psychologists, including a Rising Star Award from the American Psychological Association. His later research has continued to build on the findings he made in the past with even more exciting results. With Henry Carlos Santos, for example, he looked at long-term data from previous health and well-being surveys that had, by chance, asked about some of the qualities that are important to his definition of wisdom, like intellectual humility and open-mindedness. Sure enough, He found that people who did better on these traits at the start of the survey were more likely to be happy later on. He has also come up with ways that let him test more people. One study asked people to fill out an online diary for 9 days and asked them to write about the problems they had and fill out questionnaires about their thinking in each case. Despite the fact that some people consistently scored better than others, their behavior was still very much based on the situation at hand. In other words, even the smartest person can act foolish in the wrong situation. In personality traits like extroversion, Grossman says, people can change their behavior from a set point. A mild introvert may still prefer to be alone at work, but when she meets people she trusts, she will be more gregarious and talk more. Similarly, it's possible for someone to be smart when they deal with a confrontational coworker, but then lose their head when they deal with their ex. How can we learn to change that set point? Benjamin Franklin's writings show that wisdom can be learned. Socrates' trial changed him. According to his own autobiography, he was a disputatious young man. That changed when he read about Socrates' trial. Because of the Greek philosopher's humble way of looking into things, he decided to always question his own judgment and respect other people's. In his conversations, he didn't use words like absolutely, undoubtedly, or any other words that make an opinion sound more certain. Soon, it became a way of life. People have never heard a dogmatic expression from him in the last 50 years. He said in a letter, in the end, Grossman's research on evidence-based wisdom needed someone with a humble and open mind like that. Franklin wrote in 1755, I find that a frank acknowledgement of one's ignorance is not only the easiest way to get rid of a problem, but also the most likely way to get more information, and so I practice it. Those who think they know everything, and so try to explain everything, often don't know many things that other people could and would teach them if they looked less conceited. Unfortunately, scientific research shows that good intentions may not be enough. When Charles Lord did a well-known psychological study in the late 1970s, he found that telling people to be as objective and unbiased as possible didn't help at all. Subjects, for example, still came to conclusions that fit their preconceptions and ignored evidence that disagreed with them, even though Lord told them not to. To be fair and objective, you need more than just a desire to be fair and objective. You also need practical ways to correct your blinded reasoning. Franklin, on the other hand, had already come up with some of these strategies, which psychologists didn't know about until centuries later. He used a letter to Joseph Priestley in 1772 to show how he thought about things. It had been agreed that the British clergyman and scientist would be in charge of the education of Lord Shelburne's children. This job would be great for money, but it would also mean giving up his job as a minister, which he thought was the noblest of all professions. So he wrote to Franklin for help. I can't, because I don't have enough information, tell you what to do in an important situation like this. But if you want, I'll tell you how to go about it. Oral algebra, this is what he called his method. It was like a modern pros and cons list. He would then think very carefully about each one and give them a number based on how important they were. If a pro and a con were the same, he would cross them both off the list. After a few days of more thought, if nothing new important comes up on either side, I decide what to do. Franklin said that the values he put on each reason were not scientific. He said that when he looked at each one individually and compared them to the whole, he thought he could make better decisions and be less likely to make a rash move. The quick lists of benefits and drawbacks that most of us write down in a notebook aren't as careful as Franklin's. The way he carefully weighs each thing and the way he always waits for his thoughts to settle before making a decision are important. Franklin seems to have been aware that we tend to focus on the reasons that are the easiest to remember, because some people base their decisions on facts that happen to be present in the mind. He said, while the best reasons were absent. This is, in fact, a big source of bias when we try to think. That's why it's so important to give yourself some time to think about all the arguments before you make your decision. You don't have to follow Franklin's moral algebra to the letter to avoid making a range of reasoning mistakes, such as anchoring, overconfidence, and the my side bias. If you deliberately take the time to consider the opposite, you can cut down on these mistakes. The benefits seem to be strong in a wide range of decisions, from allowing people to question health claims to forming an opinion on capital punishment and reducing sexism. Trying to think of reasons why your first thought might be wrong was the goal in each case. As the 13th century philosopher Thomas Aquinas, on the other hand, used similar methods in his inquiries into theology and philosophy. Jason Beer, a modern philosopher who is a big fan of intellectual humility, says that Aquinas tried to make his objections as strong or forceful as possible. We'll learn more about him in Chapter 8. Then, he fights back against those points with the same amount of force. At some point, his view comes to some kind of balance. Depending on the size of the decision, you might want to repeat this process a few times, each time looking for a new piece of information that you didn't think to look for the first time around. As a result, you should also pay attention to how you think about evidence that contradicts your gut instinct. Even after you have acknowledged its existence, you may still be tempted to dismiss it out of hand. Instead, you might ask yourself, would I have made the same decision if the same evidence had worked for the other side? Is this how it goes for you? You might be wondering what job to take. Like Priestley, you have asked a friend, and he or she says that you should take the job, like Priestley did. Is that what you'd have done if your friend had been against the decision? Ord's research shows that this kind of approach can help us not be so quick to dismiss evidence that doesn't fit our preferred point of view. A friend or coworker might be able to help you think about how someone else might look at the reasons you give. Many studies have shown that when we think we'll have to explain our thinking to someone else, we think about more points of view. He may not have used this kind of moral algebra in every situation, but the general principle that he made a conscious effort to be open-minded seems to have led to many of his most important decisions. Is everything that I did for the public's benefit? Getting a fire department set up, the streets paved, a library built, schools for the poor helped, and much more. They show how good he was at reading people and convincing them to do what he wanted them to do, says historian Robert Middlecoff, who is writing this book. He calculated and measured, he weighed, and he looked at what he had. There was a kind of quantification in the way he thought about things. He thought in a way that made sense. People do not always like this way of thinking. During times of crisis, we look up to strong leaders who will stay true to their beliefs. Even Franklin was once thought to be too soft to negotiate with the British during the War of Independence. After becoming one of the commissioners, he turned out to be very smart. People who are good leaders may have a more open-minded way of thinking. One analysis, for example, looked at the texts of General Assembly speeches about the Middle East conflict from 1947 to 1976 and rated them for how well they thought about and integrated other viewpoints. This kind of open-minded thinking was important to Grossman's measure of wisdom. The researchers found that this score always went down before a war, but it seemed to stay high for a longer time when there was no war. After the fact, it would be a waste of time to pay too much attention to post hoc analyses. People naturally become more closed-minded when there is a lot of stress. And lab experiments have shown that people who score low on these measures are more likely to use aggressive methods. So does a look at the US's most important political crises over the last 100 years, like John F. Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis and Robert Nixon's handling of the Cambodian invasion in 1970. As well as the Yom Kippur War in 1973, to back up the idea. Analysis of the speeches, letters, and official statements made by presidents and their secretaries of state show that the level of open-mindedness consistently led to better negotiations, with JFK and Dwight Eisenhower both getting high marks for how they handled the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the two Taiwan Strait conflicts between China and Taiwan in the 1950s. In recent politics, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, is known for her analytical detachment because she listens to all sides before making a decision. One senior government official called her the best analyst I could imagine. The Germans have even come up with a new word, Merkeln, to Merkel, that captures this patient, deliberative stance. It's not always a good thing, though, because it can also be frustratingly indecisive, which is not always a good thing. Sometimes, she says, she is seen as a person who always takes her time. I think it is very important to take people along and really listen to them in political talks, she says, and it has worked out well for her, allowing her to remain one of the longest-serving European leaders even though there have been some very bad economic times. Merkel, Eisenhower, and Franklin are patient and careful drivers. Even though they have powerful engines, they know when to slow down and check the terrain before deciding on a course of action. Even though they have powerful engines, Franklin's moral algebra is just one of many possible ways to become wise. Solomon's paradox, which Grossman named after the legendary king of Israel in the 10th century BC, gives us even more ideas. According to the Bible, God told Solomon in a dream that he could get a special gift at the start of his reign. Instead of wealth, honor, or long life, he chose wisdom of judgment. Before long, 2 prostitutes appeared in front of him, and both claimed to be the mother of a child. His sense of right and wrong soon came into play. This is what Solomon did. He ordered that the child be cut in 2, because he knew that the true mother would rather give up her claim than see her son die. People came from all over the country to get advice from him. The decision is often seen as the best example of impartial judgment. He led the land to wealth and built the temple in Jerusalem, which is where the city is. Solomon, on the other hand, is said to have had a hard time using his famously wise judgment in his own life, which was ruled by wild passions. If, for example, he was the top Jewish priest, he broke the Torah's rules by having 1,000 wives and concubines, and he had a lot of money. His son didn't get an education because his father was too busy taking care of business to teach him how to be a tyrant. So he didn't have time to do that. In the end, chaos and war broke out in the kingdom. Grossman has discovered the same disparity in his own wisdom tests 3 millennia later. Many people, like Solomon, reason wisely about other people's problems, but struggle to reason effectively about their own problems as they become more arrogant in their beliefs and less able to compromise. Another sort of bias blind hole. When we are threatened, these kinds of errors appear to be more common, activating so-called hot emotional processing, which is restricted and closed-minded. The good news is that by practicing a technique known as self-distancing, we can take advantage of Solomon's paradox. Consider a recent event that has made you upset to get a sense of its potential. Take a few steps back and describe the emerging event to yourself, almost as if you were watching yourself from another room or on a movie screen. What were your thoughts on the situation? Ethan Kross of the University of Michigan has demonstrated in a series of trials that employing cool rather than hot processing enables people to adopt a more contemplative approach to their challenges. He discovered, for example, that they were more inclined to use neutral language when describing the scenario, and that they began to explore for the root causes of their dissatisfaction rather than focused on little details. Think about these 2 scenarios. The first is from a first-person perspective that is immersed. I was astounded when my lover said he couldn't connect with me because he believed I was going to hell. I cried and sat on the floor of my dorm corridor, trying to persuade him that my religion and his were the same. I was able to see the argument more clearly, says the second from a distance. I empathized with myself at first, but then I realized how my friend felt. I understand his motivation, even though it was irrational. You can see how for the second participant, the incident grew less personal and more abstract, and he or she began to go beyond their own experience to comprehend the dispute. This isn't just another type of avoidance or suppression. According to Kross, in an interview, he explained, "Our intention was not to remove people from the incident, but to give them a small amount of distance, hold them back a little bit, and that allow them to address the feeling from a healthier perspective. When you do this from a first-person perspective, people prefer to focus on themselves. They can shift into this meaning-making mode by distancing themselves from the incident and placing it in a larger context. He's reproduced the discovery several times since then, using various self-distancing techniques. You may pretend to be a fly on the wall or a well-intentioned observer. For example, alternatively, envision yourself as an older, wiser version of yourself, reflecting back on the experience in the future, simply speaking in the third person about your experiences. David was talking to Natasha Wen, can help you shift your perspective. Many people, according to Cross, automatically separate themselves from unpleasant feelings in order to digest them. He cites an interview in which basketball player LeBron James explained why he chose the Miami Heat over the Cleveland Cavaliers, who had nurtured his career. "I didn't want to make an emotional decision," she says. "I wanted to do what I thought was best for LeBron James and what made him happy." Malala Yousafzai, on the other hand, utilized a similar strategy to reinforce her fortitude in the face of the Taliban. "I used to believe that the Tali would appear and murder me, but then I thought to myself, what would you do if he came? Then I'd tell myself, Malala, just take a shoe and slam it against him.